Thank you for joining on today's Cryptid Horror Stories. The first story today is called The Valley of Cleansing. This is a horror story about Bigfoot. And in this story, a group of 8 urban explorers and amateur cryptid hunters travel deep into a remote, undocumented valley in the Olympic Peninsula. They aren't looking for a monster for fame. They are following the journals of a grandfather who disappeared in the 1970s. The second story today is called The Canopy's Weight. This is a horror story about the Agropelter. And is this story a remote, privately owned stretch of old-growth forest in the Pacific Northwest, currently being leased to a modern sustainable logging company? A safety inspector tasked with investigating a spike in freak accidents. Workers are reporting falling limb syndrome, but the physics don't add up. Branches are hitting workers horizontally, not vertically. The forest is unnaturally quiet. The birds have stopped singing in specific sectors of the woods. In the description below, the stories have been time-stamped. Now for today's Cryptid Horror Stories, I hope you all enjoy. The Valley of Cleansing. The toothbrush had been white once, or perhaps a pale blue, but now it was the color of the earth itself, caked with mud and something darker that might have been blood or might have been the rich iron oxide of the Olympic Peninsula soil. Marcus Yarrow knelt in the dirt, his knees sinking into the loam, his hands shaking so violently that the bristles scraped against his forearm in stuttering, irregular strokes. He was scrubbing the skin of his left forearm with a desperate, mechanical repetition that suggested a man trying to erase not dirt but sin itself. Tears cut channels through the grime on his face, and his breath came in hitching sobs that seemed to catch in his throat like barbed wire. Around him stood the others, 6 of them now, though there had been 8 when the sun rose yesterday morning. They stood in a loose circle, not reaching out to help, not speaking words of comfort, but watching with the hollow-eyed stare of people who had already seen too much to believe that comfort existed anymore. The afternoon light filtered through the canopy in pale, watery shafts, and somewhere in the distance, a crow called out 3 sharp notes before falling silent. "It can smell the chemicals," Marcus whispered, his voice cracking on the word chemicals, breaking it into 2 syllables that sounded like separate wounds. "Please, for the love of God, tell me you didn't use the soap. Please tell me nobody used the soap." He looked up at them then, his eyes wide and white against the mud, his mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite a scream. "The soap," he repeated, as if the word itself were a prayer or a curse. "The synthetic soap. It can smell the synthetic soap." Nobody answered him. Nobody moved. They had all heard the knocking in the night, the rhythmic, deliberate sound of wood against wood that had echoed through the valley like a heartbeat. They had all smelled the stench that rolled over their camp at dawn, the rotting meat and skunk spray that seemed to cling to the inside of their nostrils like a physical presence, and they had all seen the mules. But that had come later. Before the mules, before the smell, before the knocking that wasn't quite random, there had been the wrongness. The wrongness had started 3 days earlier when the 8 of them, Marcus, his sister Alina, the twins Jard and Derek, the photographer Priya, the survivalist Cole, the journalist Ben, and the quiet graduate student Teresa, had descended into the valley. They weren't tourists seeking a weekend thrill, weren't YouTubers chasing viral fame with shaky camera footage and exaggerated screams. They were following the journals of Marcus and Alina's grandfather, Arthur Yarrow, who had vanished in this same valley in the autumn of 1974. Arthur had been a timber surveyor, a man who knew the Olympic Peninsula's forests the way most people know their own neighborhoods. He had mapped old-growth stands, flagged trees for selective harvest, and kept meticulous journals filled with sketches of root systems and notations about soil acidity. But in his final journal, the one recovered from his abandoned campsite by a search party that never found his body, the careful scientific observations had given way to frantic scribbles. "The trees are leaning," he had written. "The trees are leaning together, and I don't know why. I don't know what's making them lean. I can smell it on my clothes. I can smell it on my skin. I need to get the smell off. I need to get clean. They had found the first tripod structure on their second day in the valley. Marcus had been the one to spot it, halting in mid-step and raising his hand in a silent signal that stopped the rest of the group. Before them, in a clearing no larger than a suburban backyard, 3 massive Douglas firs had been arranged with impossible precision. Each tree, trunk thick as a wine barrel and 60 feet tall, had been uprooted or snapped at the base and leaned against its neighbors, forming a perfect tripod that rose 40 feet into the air. The bark had been stripped from the contact points, as if by friction or by something rubbing against it repeatedly, and the exposed wood beneath was polished to a satin sheen. "That's not natural," Priya had said, her camera hanging forgotten around her neck. "That's not Windthrow, that's not anything." Cole, the survivalist who had spent 6 years as a search and rescue volunteer in the Cascades, had walked around the structure 3 times before speaking. "These trees weigh 5 tons each," he said finally, his voice low. "Minimum, to lean them like this, to balance them so perfectly. You'd need heavy equipment, a crane, and even then, why would anyone do this in the middle of nowhere?" "Maybe someone did," Jard had suggested. "Maybe it's art or a hunting blind." "It's not a hunting blind," Teresa said. She was the quietest of the group, a forestry student who had spent more time with Arthur's journals than anyone else. "Look at the ground. Look at the soil disturbance. These weren't dragged here. They were placed, carefully, methodically, and look at the dates on the bark." They had looked and Priya had photographed, and the unease had settled over them like a cold fog. The inner surfaces of the tripod showed growth rings that didn't match the outer bark. The trees had been leaning for decades, yet the bark at the contact points was fresh, as if something had been maintaining the structure, polishing it, keeping it precise. They had made camp that night in a meadow beside a creek, and the wrongness had deepened. The forest around them was too quiet. No insects chirped. No owls called. The only sound was the creek, running over stones with a whisper that seemed almost deliberate, almost language-like. Marcus had built a fire while Cole strung a perimeter line of bells and reflective tape, and Alina had read aloud from Arthur's final journal, her voice barely audible above the crackling flames. "It watches from the trees," she had read, her finger tracing the frantic handwriting. "It doesn't come down to the ground unless it has to. It prefers to move above where the branches are thick enough to hold its weight. I saw it yesterday. Just a shoulder, just a flash of reddish-brown fur behind a cedar trunk. But the size is impossible. The shoulder was as high as my head and it was crouching." Ben, the journalist, had asked the question they were all thinking. If your grandfather saw something that big, that close, why didn't he run? Why didn't he get out of the valley? Alina had closed the journal and stared into the fire. "Because he couldn't find the trail," she said softly. "The last entry says he walked for 2 days trying to get back to the ridge, but the valley kept changing. The landmarks moved. The creek looped back on itself. He wrote that the forest was hurting him." They had slept in shifts that night and none of them had slept well. Marcus had taken the first watch, sitting with his back to the fire, watching the darkness beyond the ring of light. At 2:47 a.m., according to his watch, he had heard the first knock. It came from the east, a sharp, percussive crack that sounded exactly like a heavy branch striking a hollow trunk. He had frozen, his hand moving instinctively toward the hunting knife at his belt, and waited. 30 seconds later, the second knock came, this time from the northeast. Then, after another pause, a third from the north. He had woken the others and they had sat in a circle around the fire, weapons ready, listening as the knocks continued. Not random, they realized after the first few minutes. Deliberate, methodical. A knock from the east, then the northeast, then the north, then the northwest. The sounds were moving around them in a slow, inexorable arc, and the intervals between them were perfectly consistent, like a clock ticking or a metronome marking time. "It's woodpeckers," Derek had whispered, though his face was pale in the firelight. "Or falling branches. Temperature changes make them crack. At perfectly timed intervals, Teresa had asked, in a perfect circle around our camp. They had stayed awake until dawn, and when the sun rose, the knocking stopped as if switched off. But the wrongness remained. Marcus had found tracks in the mud near the creek, prints that dwarfed his size 11 hiking boot, each toe impression deep enough to hold a cup of water. The prints led away from camp in a straight line, then vanished at the base of a cedar tree whose lowest branch was 20 feet overhead. That had been 2 days ago. Now, on the 4th morning of their expedition, Marcus knelt in the dirt with the toothbrush, and the others watched, and the smell hit them. It came without warning, rolling over the camp like a wave. The stench of rotting meat, thick and cloying, mixed with the sharp, acrid spray of a skunk, but magnified 100 times, concentrated into something that seemed almost solid. It wasn't the smell of a dead animal encountered by chance in the woods. It was the smell of a slaughterhouse, of an abattoir of mass death left to fester in the sun. Priya gagged and doubled over, her hand pressed to her mouth. Ben stumbled backward, his eyes watering, and Cole simply stood very still, his face going gray beneath his tan. "The mules," Elena managed to say, her voice barely audible above the sound of her own retching. "Oh God, the mules!" They had tethered the animals at the edge of camp, 30 yards away in a small clearing where the grass was thick and the creek ran close. The mules, Daisy and Buttercup, had been their pack animals, carrying 70 pounds of gear each through the valley's unforgiving terrain. They were gentle, reliable creatures, chosen specifically for their calm temperament and sure footing. Now, as the group stumbled through the undergrowth toward the clearing, they found them. The sight stopped them in their tracks. The tethering line had been snapped, not cut, the hemp rope broken cleanly as if by tremendous force. Daisy lay in the center of the clearing, and the sight of her was so wrong, so violently incorrect, that several of them turned away immediately, unable to process what they were seeing. The mule had been broken in half. Not eaten, not mauled in the way of a bear or mountain lion, but literally snapped. Her spine cracked and separated at the lumbar region, her hindquarters twisted to face backward while her forequarters remained in their original position. The break was clean, almost surgical, the vertebrae shattered and protruding from the skin like white fingers. There was no blood spray, no sign of a struggle. The grass around her was undisturbed, as if she had been lifted, broken, and placed back down with careful precision. Buttercup had been dragged 10 feet to the left, and what remained of her was worse. The creature had seemingly used her as a tool, a marker, painting the trunk of a nearby fir with her intestines in broad, looping strokes that dripped and steamed in the cool morning air. The organs had been arranged deliberately, the liver placed on a low branch, the heart impaled on a broken stub of wood at eye level. The message was unmistakable, though it used no words. This is the border. Cross it, and this is what waits. Marcus had been the first to speak, his voice barely a whisper. "We need to get out of here. We need to get out of here right now." But even as he said it, they heard the knocking begin again. East, northeast, north. The sonic arc was forming, the circle tightening, and for the first time they understood that the sound wasn't just communication. It was hurting. It was driving them. And the only direction left to run was deeper into the valley, away from the ridge and the trail and any hope of rescue. They packed in silence, moving with the desperate efficiency of people who knew that speed mattered more than organization. They left the tents, the cooking gear, anything that couldn't be carried on their backs. Marcus shoved his grandfather's journal into his pack with trembling hands, and Alina gathered the first aid kit and what little food remained. Cole took point, his rifle held low and ready, and Priya shouldered her camera bag, though she hadn't taken a photograph since the tripod structure. They moved east, toward where they believed the ridge trail lay, but the knocking tracked them. Always to their left, always ahead, the sharp cracks of wood against wood guiding them away from the familiar landmarks and into terrain that grew denser, darker, more alien with every mile. The underbrush thickened until they were forced to move single file, pushing through walls of devil's club and salmonberry whose thorns caught their clothes and skin. The trees grew older, larger, their trunks so massive that 3 people linking arms couldn't encircle them, and the wrongness intensified. They passed a second tripod structure at noon, this one larger than the first, built from 3 cedars instead of firs. The polished contact points gleamed in the dappled light, and arranged at the base were bones. Not animal bones, human bones, a femur still articulated at the knee joint, a rib cage cracked open and spread like wings, a skull wedged between 2 roots, facing outward with its empty sockets staring directly at the path they were being herded down. "That's not Grandpa," Elena said, though her voice shook. "The journal said they never found him, that's someone else." "That's not comforting," Ben replied, his journalist's composure cracking around the edges. "If that's someone else, how many someones have there been?" They didn't stop to count. They moved faster, stumbling now, the panic beginning to set in. The knocking grew louder, closer, no longer maintaining its polite distance but pressing in from all sides, east and west simultaneously, north and south. The creature or creatures were communicating, coordinating, and the sound had become a cage whose bars were made of percussive noise. At 3:17 p.m. by Marcus's watch, they heard the first scream. It came from behind them, back toward the direction of the mule clearing, and it was Jard's voice, unmistakable, crying out, "Help me! Oh God, help me, it's got my—" The sound cut off abruptly, replaced by a wet, crunching snap that echoed through the trees like a gunshot. They froze. Derek, Jard's twin, took a step back toward the sound, his face contorted with a grief that hadn't fully formed yet. "That's Jard," he said, his voice flat and strange. "That's my brother. We have to go back. We have to." "No," Cole's voice was iron. "We go back, we die. We go forward, maybe we live. That's the only choice." "But he's my brother. And if you go back, you'll join him. Look up, Derek. Look up and tell me what you see." Derek looked up, and the breath left his lungs in a single gasp. Above them, in the canopy 60 feet overhead, something massive was moving. They couldn't see it clearly. The leaves and branches were too thick, the light too scattered, but they could see its effect. Whole sections of the canopy swayed and dipped as if under the weight of a falling tree, yet there was no crash, no impact. Whatever was moving up there was distributing its weight across multiple branches, moving with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for something so large. And it was following them, tracking their progress from above, staying always just out of sight but never out of awareness. They ran. There was no more pretense of strategy, no more attempt at quiet movement. They crashed through the underbrush, their packs bouncing, their breath burning in their lungs. The knocking became a constant, maddening percussion, and above them the canopy swayed and cracked with the passage of the unseen thing. It was Teresa who fell first. She caught her boot on a root and went down hard, her cry of pain lost in the chaos of their flight. Marcus turned back for her, reaching down to grab her arm, and in that moment he saw it. It wasn't in the canopy. It was on the ground, not 20 feet away, and the sight of it stopped Marcus's heart for a full beat before it hammered back to life at double speed. The creature was crouched behind a fallen log, and what Marcus saw was only a fraction of its bulk. A shoulder, massive and covered in reddish-brown fur the color of dried blood, rising higher than Marcus's head even in the crouched position. The fur was matted and coarse, but beneath it, muscles rippled and shifted with a terrible, liquid power. The shoulder was attached to an arm, if it could be called an arm, that ended in a hand the size of a dinner plate, fingers thick as sausages, tipped with claws that looked like blackened bone. And then it moved. Not toward them, but upward, launching itself from the ground with a force that cracked the log beneath it, catching a branch 15 feet overhead and swinging into the canopy with a grace that belied its impossible size. It was there and then gone, vanished into the leaves, and the only proof that Marcus hadn't hallucinated it was the cracked log and the smell that lingered in its wake, the rotting meat and skunk spray, but underneath it, something else. Something musky and ancient and utterly inhuman. "Get up," Marcus gasped, hauling Teresa to her feet. Get up, we have to run, we have to." They ran until their legs gave out, until their lungs were fire and their vision blurred at the edges. They ran until the knocking faded behind them, until the canopy stopped swaying, until they collapsed in a small hollow where a spring bubbled up from between moss-covered rocks. There were 6 of them now. 6, where there had been 8. Derek sat with his back to a tree, his face blank, his eyes focused on nothing. "Jard's dead," he said, not a question but a statement of fact that he was still learning to believe. "Something broke him. I heard it break him." "We all heard it," Priya whispered. She was shaking, her camera bag abandoned somewhere in the flight, her hands pressed between her knees as if to keep them from flying apart. "What was that? What the hell was that?" "Sasquatch," Ben said, the word sounding absurd and inadequate. "Bigfoot. People have reported them in the Olympics for decades." "That wasn't Bigfoot," Cole said. His rifle was still in his hands, but his hands were shaking now, the first time Marcus had seen him lose composure. "Bigfoot doesn't break mules in half. Bigfoot doesn't arrange bones in patterns. Bigfoot doesn't hunt from the treetops like a goddamn ape. That was something else. Something that makes Bigfoot look like a children's story." "We need to keep moving," Alina said. She was bandaging Teresa's ankle with strips torn from her own shirt, her movements clinical and precise, the way she had learned in her EMT training. "We need to find the ridge. If we can get above the tree line, if we can find a clearing, maybe we can signal for help." "We don't even know where we are," Ben pointed out. "The GPS hasn't worked since yesterday. The compass spins. We're lost, Alina. We're lost in a valley that's actively trying to kill us." "Then we follow the water," Marcus said quietly. He had taken out his grandfather's journal and was flipping through the water-stained pages with trembling fingers. "Grandpa wrote about this spring. He said it led to a cave system. He said there were trophies." They all looked at him. "Trophies," Derek repeated, his voice hollow. "What kind of trophies?" Marcus didn't answer. He just closed the journal and stood up, shouldering his pack with a grunt of effort. "The cave is this way," he said, pointing toward where the spring drained into a narrow ravine. "If Grandpa found it, we can find it, and maybe there'll be something we can use. Another way out, a map, something." Nobody believed him, but nobody had a better idea. They followed the spring, limping and stumbling, their nerves frayed to the consistency of overstressed wire. The ravine deepened, the walls rising in limestone cliffs that dripped with moisture and glowed faintly with patches of phosphorescent lichen. The air grew colder, denser, and the smell of the forest, pine and cedar and clean earth, gave way to something else, something close and organic and wrong. They found the cave entrance at dusk, a narrow fissure in the limestone that breathed out a current of air so cold it made their teeth ache. And arranged around the entrance, hung from the low branches of the scraggly oaks that clung to the cliff face, were the trophies. Backpacks, dozens of them in various states of decay. Some were modern, recognizable brands in faded colors. Others were older, canvas and leather, the kind that hadn't been manufactured since the 1970s. They hung like strange fruit, their straps tangled in the branches, their pockets open and empty, and beneath them, arranged in a careful circle, were the other trophies. Watches, compasses, boots, and bones. So many bones. "This is the larder," Teresa said, her voice barely audible. "This is where it keeps them, where it keeps us." "We can't go in there," Priya said, backing away. "We can't go in there, that's where it lives, that's where it—" "We don't have a choice," Cole interrupted. "It's almost dark. We're out of food, out of water, and that thing is still out there. The cave is narrow. If it can't fit, we're safe. If it can fit—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They entered the cave one by one, Marcus leading with his grandfather's journal clutched to his chest like a shield. The passage narrowed until they were crawling on hands and knees, the limestone scraping their palms and the cold seeping through their clothes like a liquid. Behind them the last light of day faded, and from somewhere in the valley the knocking began again. East. northeast, north, the circle forming, the hunt continuing. And deep in the cave, where the passage widened into a chamber whose ceiling vanished in darkness, they found Arthur Yarrow's final camp. The chamber opened before them like the throat of some great stone beast, its ceiling lost in darkness far above, its walls sweating moisture that ran in slow rivulets down the limestone and collected in pools on the uneven floor. Marcus's flashlight beam trembled as it swept across the space, catching on stalactites that hung like yellowed teeth, on mineral deposits that gleamed with an organic sheen, and on the objects that had been arranged with deliberate care along the eastern wall. Arthur Yarrow's final camp was not a random scattering of abandoned gear, but a tableau frozen in time, a moment of ordinary life interrupted by something extraordinary. His backpack lay in the corner, the canvas rotted through in places, the aluminum frame bent but still recognizable as the same model Marcus had seen in photographs from his childhood. Marcus approached it slowly, his footsteps loud in the vast silence of the cave, and knelt beside it with a reverence that felt almost religious. The buckles crumbled under his fingers, rusted metal flaking away like dried skin, and when he opened the main compartment, the smell that rose from within was not of mold or decay, but of something older, something that smelled like the cave itself, like earth and time and the slow dissolution of memory. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had fused to itself over the decades, were the remaining pages of Arthur's journal. Marcus lifted them carefully, feeling the paper crumble at the edges, and began to read by the light of his failing flashlight. The handwriting grew progressively more frantic as the entries progressed, the careful block letters of a surveyor giving way to a scrawl that slanted upward across the page, as if trying to climb off the paper itself. Day 12, Marcus read aloud, his voice hollow in the chamber's vastness. The knocking has not stopped for 3 days. It follows me wherever I go. I tried to climb the ridge yesterday, but the trail curved back on itself, and I found myself at the same creek crossing I had left 4 hours earlier. The forest is wrong. The trees move when I'm not looking. I can hear them shifting in the dark, and the smell is everywhere now, on my clothes, in my hair, in my skin. I used the last of my soap this morning, the Irish Spring I packed from home, and within an hour the knocking was closer than it had ever been. It can smell the chemicals. It can smell the chemicals. It can smell the chemicals. Stop, Priya whispered. Please stop reading. But Marcus couldn't stop. The words had hooked into him like barbs, and he continued, his voice growing softer as the entries grew more disturbed. Day 13. I found the cave. The entrance is narrow, but the chamber inside is vast. I thought I was safe. I thought the narrow passage would keep it out. But I can hear it above me, moving on the cliff face, testing the rock with its claws. It knows I'm here. It doesn't need to see me. It can smell the soap on my skin, the deodorant, the laundry detergent from my shirt. I tried to wash it off in the spring, but the smell only spread. I need to get clean. I need to get clean. I need to get clean. The final entry was not dated. It consisted of a single paragraph written in letters so large and deep that Marcus could feel the indentations through the paper. IT doesn't eat. IT doesn't hunt for food. It hunts for purity. The valley was here before US, and it will be here after. We are the invaders. We are the stain. And it will scrub US from the earth until every trace of our scent is gone. Get clean, GET, clean, GAT, clean, get, clean, get. The writing ended in a long gouge that tore through 3 pages, as if the pen had been dragged sideways with tremendous force, or as if something had struck the journal from Arthur's hand. Marcus set the pages down with trembling fingers and looked at the wall above the fire ring. In the flickering light, he could see what he had missed before. The words "get clean" were not the only message scratched into the limestone. Below them, in smaller letters in a hand that was recognizably Arthur's but grown shaky with exhaustion and terror, were coordinates, latitude and longitude, the ranger station. He found it, Marcus breathed. He found the station, he knew where it was. Then why didn't he go? Alina asked. Because he couldn't get past them, Teresa said. She was standing at the cave entrance, her flashlight pointed outward, and her voice had gone flat and strange. Look at the floor. Look at the passage. They looked, and Marcus felt his stomach drop into his boots. The floor of the chamber, which he had assumed was natural limestone, was covered in scratches. Hundreds of them. Thousands. Parallel grooves in the stone that spiraled inward from the walls toward the fire ring, as if something had paced this chamber for hours, for days, turning in endless circles while it waited for prey that never emerged. And in the passage that led to the surface, visible now in the combined light of all their flashlights, were marks on the walls. Claw marks. 5 parallel grooves in the limestone, each one an inch deep, running the full length of the passage from the chamber to the surface. Whatever had been waiting above the entrance had tried to dig its way in. Repeatedly. Patiently. It doesn't need to fit, Ben said, his voice barely audible. It just needs to wait. They settled in for the night with a fatalism that felt almost like acceptance. There was no firewood in the chamber, no material for a fire, and Cole refused to use his remaining matches. We might need them, he said, though for what he didn't specify. They sat in a tight cluster near the back wall, their flashlights turned low to conserve batteries, and passed the canteen of water between them in slow, measured sips. The darkness in the cave was not like darkness above ground. It had weight. It had texture. It pressed against their eyeballs and filled their ears with a ringing silence that was somehow louder than noise. Marcus sat with his back against the cold stone, his grandfather's journal clutched against his chest, and listened to the sounds of the others. Priya's ragged breathing, Ben's occasional whispered prayers, Alina's soft humming, tuneless and compulsive, the same 4 notes repeated endlessly. Derek's silence, which was the most frightening sound of all. Sometime around midnight, Marcus heard the breathing from above. Not from the chamber, from the cliff face outside, from the canopy beyond the entrance. It was slow and deep and rhythmic, each inhalation lasting 5 full seconds, each exhalation accompanied by a low rumble that vibrated through the limestone and into Marcus's spine. He counted the breaths, trying to keep his own breathing shallow and silent, and reached 147 before Priya screamed. It was a short, sharp cry born of nightmare rather than waking terror, but it echoed off the chamber walls with a clarity that made them all flinch. And from directly above the cave entrance, from somewhere on the cliff face, came an answering sound. Not a knock this time, but a single, deliberate scratch. 5 parallel grooves in stone, the sound of claws testing rock. A warning, a reminder, we know where you are. Nobody slept after that. They sat in frozen silence, waiting for dawn, and when the pale light finally filtered into the chamber, it revealed what the darkness had hidden. Fresh claw marks on the passage walls, deeper than before, and on the floor near the entrance, arranged in a careful circle, were small stones. 23 of them, 1 for each year since Arthur had disappeared. It was here, Alina whispered. During the night, it was right there. And it didn't come in, Cole said. His voice was steady, but his hands were shaking as he checked his rifle. Which means it can't fit, or it chose not to. Either way, we're still alive. They emerged from the cave into a world that had changed overnight. The trophies still hung from the trees, but they had been rearranged. The backpacks, which yesterday had hung at random angles, now all faced the cave entrance, their open pockets like mouths waiting to be fed. The bones had been moved, arranged in a line that pointed east toward the ridge, toward the outpost. A path, an invitation, or a trap. It wants us to go that way, Teresa said. It's hurting us again. Then we go that way, Cole said, because the alternative is staying here, and I'm not staying here. They moved east, following the bone path, their senses hyperalert to every shadow, every sound. The ravine deepened as they walked, the limestone walls rising higher on either side until they were marching through a canyon whose walls blocked out the sun and turned the morning into permanent twilight. The air grew colder, denser, and the smell of the forest, pine and cedar and clean earth, gave way to something else, something close and organic and wrong. They found the first body at mid-morning. It was wedged between two boulders at the ravine's mouth, or what remained of a body, a torso, still wearing a faded green jacket, the arms torn away at the shoulder sockets, the head crushed to a shapeless mass. The jacket was from the 1980s, based on the label, and in the breast pocket they found a wallet containing a driver's license and a photograph of a smiling woman holding a baby. The name on the license was Stephen Marsh. The date of birth made him 34 when he died. 34, Marcus thought, and now he was a torso wedged between rocks, his arms somewhere in the underbrush, his head a smear on a boulder. "Don't look at it," Alina said, but she was looking at it, her eyes fixed on the photograph, her face pale and stricken. "Don't look at it and don't touch it. We don't know what disease is." "It didn't eat him," Teresa interrupted. Her voice was clinical, detached, the voice of a scientist observing data rather than a human being looking at death. "Look at the wounds. The arms weren't bitten off. They were twisted off, rotated until the joints separated, and the head was crushed, not bitten, crushed, like a melon, like something squeezed it until it burst." "That's enough," Cole snapped. "We keep moving now." They kept moving. The ravine opened into a broader valley, the trees growing taller, older, their trunks so massive that three people linking arms couldn't encircle them. The underbrush thickened until they were forced to move single file, pushing through walls of devil's club and salmonberry whose thorns caught their clothes and skin. And always, always, the knocking tracked them. East, northeast, north. The sonic cage forming, herding them, driving them deeper into territory that felt less like a forest and more like a maze designed by something that understood geometry better than they did. It was in the third hour of their flight that the mimicry began. They were moving through a stand of ancient cedar, the trunks so massive that they created natural corridors between them, when they heard Jard's voice. Clear as day, unmistakable, coming from somewhere ahead of them in the trees. "Derek," the voice called. "Derek, I'm over here, I'm hurt, I need help." Derek stopped, his whole body going rigid. "Jard," he called back, his voice cracking. "Jard, where are you?" "Don't," Marcus snapped, grabbing Derek's arm. "That's not Jard, Jard's dead, we heard him die." "But what if he's not?" Derek demanded, pulling away. "What if he got away? What if he's trapped somewhere and needs—" The voice came again, closer now, and this time it was Alina's voice. "Marcus, Marcus, I found the trail, I found the way out. Follow my voice, follow me." Alina, standing right beside Marcus, went pale as death. "That's my voice," she whispered. "That's my voice, but I didn't." "It's the creature," Teresa said, her scientific mind struggling to process what her instincts already knew. "It can mimic us. It can recreate sounds. It's luring us into the thickets." "Derek, please," Jard's voice begged. It hurts so much." Derek made his choice. He broke away from Marcus's grip and ran toward the sound, crashing through the underbrush with a desperate speed that carried him beyond their reach in seconds. They heard him calling Jard's name, heard the underbrush crashing, heard the silence that followed. Then, from the direction Derek had run, they heard the wet snap of breaking bone, and a scream that started high and sharp and ended in a gurgling choke. "No," Priya moaned, sinking to her knees in the mud. "No, no, no." They didn't go after him. They couldn't. They moved forward, always forward, their numbers dwindling to 5, and the mimicry started again. This time it was Ben's voice, calling for help from the left. Then Priya's voice, singing a lullaby from somewhere to the right. The creature was surrounding them, hurting them with sounds stolen from their own throats, and the psychological pressure was breaking them down with an efficiency that felt almost intelligent. By the time they reached the river, they were down to 4. Ben had vanished somewhere in the alder thickets, his disappearance so sudden and silent that they hadn't even heard him go. One moment he had been behind Marcus. The next, the underbrush had closed around an empty space, and there had been no scream, no struggle, just the faint rustle of something large moving quickly away. The river was shallow but wide, running over smooth stones that gleamed like skulls in the pale light. On the far bank, visible through the mist that rose from the water, they could see the first signs of the ridge. Taller trees, thinner underbrush, the suggestion of a trail. 5 miles, Cole had said. But looking at the river, at the exposed crossing that would leave them vulnerable for a full 2 minutes, Marcus understood that the creature had been waiting for this. "It'll attack here," he said. "We're exposed. We can't run in the water." "We don't have a choice," Cole replied. He was scanning the far bank with his rifle ready, but his face was gray with exhaustion and fear. "The bank on this side is too steep to follow. We cross or we die here." They entered the water in a tight group, moving as quickly as the slippery stones would allow. The current was stronger than it looked, tugging at their knees, threatening to pull their feet out from under them. The cold was shocking, a physical blow that stole their breath and cramped their muscles. And as they reached the middle of the river, the mist on the far bank began to move. Not mist, fur. Massive reddish-brown fur that blended perfectly with the dark trees behind it, using the water's reflection as camouflage, as a mirror that doubled the forest and hid the bulk crouched among the roots. They saw it in fragments, a shoulder, massive and heaving, an eye golden and slit-pupiled, reflecting the weak light, a hand, 5-fingered and tipped with claws that scored the bark of a fallen log as the creature tensed to spring. "Run!" Cole screamed, and they ran, splashing and stumbling, their packs dragging them backward into the current. Priya went down, her feet swept out by a hidden current, and Marcus reached back to grab her hand, hauling her upright with a strength he didn't know he possessed. Behind them, the creature moved. It didn't charge through the water. It leaped, launching itself from the bank with a force that cracked the log beneath its feet, covering 20 feet in a single bound that seemed to defy gravity. It landed in the shallows with a splash that sent a wave crashing over them, and for the first time, they saw it fully. 8 feet tall when standing, but crouched now in hunting posture, its body covered in matted reddish-brown fur that hung in dreadlocked ropes from its shoulders and back. The face was almost human, almost, with a heavy brow ridge and a jaw that protruded slightly, lined with teeth that were yellowed and cracked and sharp as broken glass. But the eyes were the worst. The eyes were ancient and intelligent, and utterly without mercy, golden irises surrounding vertical pupils that narrowed to slits as they fixed on their prey. Cole fired. The shot was deafening, echoing off the valley walls, and the creature flinched, a dark patch appearing in the fur of its shoulder. But it didn't fall. It didn't even pause. It moved with a fluid speed that was terrifying in something so massive, crossing the remaining distance in 2 strides, and struck Cole with a backhanded blow that sent him flying. He hit a boulder on the far bank with a sound like a bag of wet cement striking concrete, and he didn't get up. His rifle landed in the water with a splash and vanished in the current. But the creature wasn't finished. It followed Cole's body to the bank, its massive hand closing around his throat, lifting him off the ground with a casual strength that made his limp form look like a child's doll. Cole's eyes fluttered open, dazed and unfocused, and he stared into the creature's face with an expression that might have been recognition or might have been the final blankness of death. The creature studied him for a moment, its nostrils flaring, then tightened its grip. The sound of Cole's neck breaking was audible even over the rush of the river, a sharp, wet crack that echoed off the stones and seemed to hang in the air for a full second after it occurred. The creature dropped his body in the shallows, where the current caught it and began to drag it downstream, and turned toward the remaining 3 survivors. "Keep running," Alina screamed, grabbing Marcus's arm and Priya's hand, dragging them toward the far bank. "Don't look back, keep running." They ran. Behind them, the creature didn't pursue immediately. It stood in the shallows, watching them with those terrible golden eyes, and made a sound. Not a roar, not a scream, but a low, rhythmic hooting that rose and fell in a pattern that matched the knocking they had heard throughout the valley. A call. A signal. And from the canopy on both sides of the river, from the ridges above and the thickets behind, other voices answered. The realization hit Marcus like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs even as his legs continued to pump. Not one. There wasn't one creature. There was a family, a tribe, and they had been herding the group not toward a single predator but toward a gathering. They reached the far bank and scrambled up the slope, their hands clawing at mud and roots, their feet slipping on the wet earth. Behind them, the creature in the river began to move again, not rushing but following, keeping pace with a terrible patience. And above them, in the canopy that now stretched over the ridge trail, they heard the sound of branches bending under impossible weight. "The outpost," Marcus gasped, his chest heaving, his vision beginning to gray at the edges. "The ranger outpost, how far?" 2 miles, Priya managed. She was bleeding from a gash on her forehead where she had struck a branch, and her eyes were wild with panic. "Maybe 3. "We won't make 3 miles, Alina said. Her face was set in a mask of desperate determination, but her hands were shaking so badly she could barely keep her grip on Marcus's pack. "Not with that behind us, not with them above us." "Then we mask ourselves," Marcus said. The idea came to him fully formed, a desperate inspiration born of his grandfather's final words. "The chemicals, the soap, the deodorant, the laundry detergent, that's how it tracks us. That's how it knows where we are. But if we smell like the forest, if we smell like nothing human." "What are you saying?" Priya demanded. "We roll in mud, we smell like dead animals." "Yes," Marcus said, "exactly that." They found the carrion in a hollow just off the trail, a deer that had been dead for days, its body swollen and crawling with maggots, the smell so overwhelming that it made the creature's musk seem almost pleasant by comparison. The carcass had been partially consumed, but enough remained: the rotting hide, the putrid entrails, the foul black sludge that pooled beneath it. They stripped off their outer layers, their synthetic jackets and treated shirts, and they coated themselves in the mud and the rot, rubbing the foul mess into their hair, their faces, their hands, working it into every pore until they no longer smelled like humans but like the forest itself, like death itself. The effect was immediate and terrifying. Above them, the movement in the canopy stopped. The rhythmic hooting paused, then changed pitch, becoming uncertain, questioning. The creature on the trail behind them halted, its golden eyes narrowing, its nostrils flaring as it tested the air. And for the first time since the nightmare began, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. "Move," he whispered. "Slowly, don't run. Running makes noise." They moved like ghosts, sliding through the underbrush with a slowness that tested their sanity, every instinct screaming at them to run, to sprint, to flee. But they held their pace, and the creatures held theirs, tracking them from above with a confusion that was almost palpable. The scent mask was working. The chemicals were hidden beneath the cloak of rot and earth. It was a small thing, a boot catching on a root, a hand shooting out to break the fall. But the movement was sudden, and the suddenness was enough. From the canopy directly above the outpost, something massive dropped, landing in the clearing with a force that cracked the earth and sent shockwaves through the soil that Marcus felt in his teeth. Not the reddish-brown creature from the river. This one was larger, its fur silvered with age, its face marked with scars that spoke of decades of dominance. The patriarch, the alpha, and its eyes, as they fixed on Priya, held none of the confusion of the younger hunters. They held recognition. Marcus had only a fraction of a second to process what he was seeing before the creature moved, and in that fraction of a second, his mind cataloged details with a terrible, dreamlike clarity. The alpha stood 9 feet tall when it straightened from its crouch, its body covered in fur that had once been reddish-brown but had faded over decades to a silver-gray, the color of storm clouds. The fur hung in thick, matted ropes from its shoulders and back, each rope braided and twisted in patterns that suggested not randomness but culture, not filth but deliberate arrangement. The face was broader than the younger creature's had been, the brow ridge heavier, the jaw more pronounced, lined with teeth that had been worn by decades of use to yellowed points. But the eyes were what stopped Marcus's breath. They were not the golden irises of the river creature, but a deeper amber, almost orange, with vertical pupils that dilated and contracted with a terrible intelligence. And in those eyes, Marcus saw something worse than hunger. He saw history. He saw memory. He saw a creature that had been cleansing this valley since before Marcus's grandfather was born, since before the first European settlers arrived, since before human memory began. It charged, not from above, not from ambush, but in a direct, overwhelming rush that tore through the saplings and underbrush like they were tissue paper. The ground shook with each stride, and Marcus felt the vibrations through the soles of his boots, up his legs, into his spine. Priya had time for a single scream before the creature was on her, its massive hand closing around her waist with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large. It lifted her off the ground with a casual strength that made her struggles look like the twitching of an insect, her arms flailing, her legs kicking at empty air. She was wearing the blue synthetic jacket she had bought for the trip, the one with the waterproof coating and the chemical-treated fabric, and Marcus saw the creature's nostrils flare as it caught the scent. It didn't snap her neck. It didn't crush her ribs. It simply squeezed, and the sound of her spine compressing, of her vertebrae popping like bubble wrap, of her internal organs rupturing under the pressure, was audible even over her final choking cry. The sound was wet and rhythmic, a series of pops that ended in a gurgling choke as blood filled her lungs and poured from her mouth in a dark cascade that stained the front of her blue jacket. The creature held her for a moment, watching the life fade from her eyes, her body going limp in its grip, her head lolling backward at an impossible angle. Then it dropped her body in the dirt, where it landed with a sound like a sack of wet laundry, and turned toward Marcus and Alina. "Run," Marcus said, but the word came out as a whisper, and Alina was already moving, sprinting toward the outpost door with a speed born of absolute terror. Marcus followed, his legs pumping, his lungs burning, the creature's footsteps thundering behind him. He felt the wind of its passage, smelled the musk of its fur, heard the rhythmic hooting that was now a chorus, a celebration, a hunting song. The ground shook with each stride the creature took, and Marcus could hear its breathing, a deep, bellows-like rhythm that filled the air with the smell of rotten meat and ancient earth. Alina reached the door first, flinging it open, dragging Marcus inside. They slammed it shut as the creature struck, the impact bending the metal frame, splintering the wood. Marcus threw the bolt, knowing even as he did that it wouldn't hold, that nothing would hold against that strength. But the creature didn't strike again. It stepped back, its golden eyes visible through the broken window, and watched. The interior of the outpost was small, a single room with a wood stove, a desk, a radio, and a narrow cot. Marcus pressed his back against the wall beneath the broken window, trying to slow his breathing, trying to think. The Alpha's eye was visible through the shattered glass, a golden slit that reflected the dim interior light. It didn't blink. It didn't move. It simply watched, and in that watching, Marcus understood something about the creature that made his blood run colder than the river water had. The creature wasn't angry. It wasn't hungry. It was performing a duty. It was removing a stain from its territory with the same methodical patience that a homeowner might use to scrub mold from a bathroom wall. "What are they waiting for?" Alina whispered. She was crouched beside him, her face pressed against his shoulder, her body shaking with silent sobs. "Why don't they just break in?" "Because they don't need to," Marcus said. "Because they know we're trapped. Because they're patient." "The radio," Alina gasped, pointing to the corner. "Call for help, call for—" Marcus was already there, his hands shaking as he turned dials, adjusted frequencies. "Mayday, mayday, this is an emergency. We need immediate extraction. Repeat, immediate extraction. We are at the Eastern Ridge Outpost, Olympic Peninsula, and we are under attack by—" He didn't know how to finish the sentence. By what? By something that shouldn't exist. By a family of creatures that had been cleansing their valley for decades, centuries longer. He settled for the truth stripped to its essence. By hostile wildlife, Multiple casualties. Please respond. Static, then miraculously a voice. Copy that, Eastern Outpost. This is Coast Guard rescue helicopter en route to your sector. We have your beacon. ETA 15 minutes. Can you hold? Marcus looked at the window where the Alpha's eye still watched, unblinking. We can hold, he said, though he didn't know if it was true. The 15 minutes were the longest of Marcus's life. The creatures didn't attack the outpost, didn't try to break down the door again. They surrounded it, moving in the tree line, occasionally revealing themselves in flashes of reddish-brown fur or golden eyes, but mostly remaining unseen, heard only in the knocking that resumed on all sides. The sonic cage was forming again, but this time it felt different. Not hurting, guarding, waiting. They were being held, not hunted, and the distinction was somehow more terrifying than the chase had been. Marcus thought of Priya's body in the clearing, of Cole floating downstream, of Derek's scream cutting off in the thickets, of Jard's wet snap, of Ben's silent disappearance. 8 had entered the valley. 2 remained, and the valley was winning. He thought of his grandfather, alone in this same valley, hearing the same knocking, smelling the same musk, writing the same desperate warnings. Had Arthur made it to this outpost? Had he stood in this same room, listening to the same sounds, waiting for rescue that never came? Marcus looked at the walls, at the scratches on the wood, and realized with a sinking heart that some of them were fresh. Some of them matched the claw marks he had seen on the cave walls. The creatures had been here before. They knew this place. They were waiting for the same thing they had always waited for, the end of human intrusion. The minutes crawled by, each one an eternity of staring at the golden eye, listening to the knocking, feeling the sweat freeze on his skin. Alina had stopped crying. She sat against the wall, her knees drawn up to her chest, her eyes fixed on the floor, and Marcus wondered if she had gone into shock, or if she had simply reached a state beyond fear where nothing could touch her anymore. When the helicopter finally appeared, its rotors beating the air in a thunderous rhythm that drowned out the knocking, the creatures didn't flee. They watched from the canopy as the rescue line was lowered, as Marcus and Alina were strapped into harnesses and lifted into the sky. The Alpha stood at the edge of the clearing, looking up, its amber eyes tracking the helicopter with an intelligence that was unmistakable. It didn't roar. It didn't charge. It simply watched, and in its watching was a promise. This is not over. This is never over. And as the helicopter banked away from the outpost, climbing toward the cloud layer, Marcus looked down. From above, the valley was beautiful. A green bowl of old-growth forest, untouched and pristine, the creek running through it like a silver thread. But as they rose higher, as the perspective shifted from ground level to aerial view, Marcus saw what he had missed from below. The tripods. Dozens of them, scores of them, arranged across the valley floor in patterns that suggested not randomness but design. A village, a settlement. And moving among the tripods, visible only as dark shapes against the green, were the creatures. Not one, not a family, a community. The Alpha stood at the edge of the forest, looking up, its golden eyes tracking the helicopter with an intelligence that was unmistakable. And beside it, smaller shapes moved, juvenile creatures learning the patterns of the hunt, carrying branches toward a new tripod that was already taking shape. The angry creature from the river hadn't been a rogue. It hadn't been a lone monster. It had been a scout, a sentinel, and the valley wasn't its territory, it was its home. Alina pressed her face against the window, her tears leaving tracks in the grime that still coated her skin. "Grandpa," she whispered. "He wasn't killed, he was removed, cleansed, like a weed, like a contaminant." Marcus didn't answer. He was looking at his hands, still caked with mud and carrion, the smell of rot clinging to him like a second skin. And he was thinking of the toothbrush, dropped somewhere in the dirt of the valley floor, lost in the flight from the cave. The toothbrush that had been white once, or perhaps pale blue, now buried in the earth where the forest would reclaim it, where the rain would wash away the last traces of synthetic soap, where the cleansing would be complete. The helicopter climbed higher, the valley shrinking to a green speck in the vastness of the peninsula, and Marcus closed his eyes. But behind his eyelids he didn't see darkness. He saw golden eyes. He heard the knocking. And he knew with a certainty that would haunt him for the rest of his life that the toothbrush wasn't lost. It was waiting for the rain to wash it clean, waiting for some future hiker to find it, to pick it up, to wonder why a toothbrush lay in the middle of an untouched valley. And somewhere below, in the green darkness of the forest, something massive shifted its weight in the canopy, and the knocking began again. East, northeast, north, the circle forming, the hunt beginning anew. The helicopter vanished into the clouds, carrying 2 survivors and a silence that spoke louder than screams. And on the valley floor, in a patch of dirt that had been disturbed by human feet, a single white bristle lay in the loam, pointing toward the sky. For a moment, nothing moved. Then a shadow fell across the earth, and a massive 5-toed foot, claws like blackened bone digging into the soil, slowly pressed down upon the bristle, grinding it into the earth with a sound like a sigh. The forest closed around the spot, moss and fern and thyme erasing the last mark of human passage. And in the canopy above, the knocking continued, patient and eternal, marking the boundary of a valley where no human scent would ever be welcome again. The cleansing was complete. The canopy's weight. The photograph arrived in an unmarked manila envelope, slid beneath the windshield wiper of Zachary Holt's Tacoma pickup, while he slept in the cramped quarters of the Timberline Motel outside Hoquiam, Washington. He found it at dawn, when the Pacific Northwest sky was the color of wet concrete, and the mist had not yet lifted from the asphalt. The envelope bore no postage, no return address, no note inside except for the single high-resolution print, glossy and sharp, depicting something that Zachary stared at for nearly 3 minutes without blinking. It was a human ribcage, or what remained of one, the bones splayed outward in a radial pattern like the spokes of a shattered wheel, each rib splintered at its terminus where some impossible force had driven them through the flesh that once contained them. The skeletal ruin had been pinned to the trunk of a cedar tree, impaled there by a single jagged pine branch as thick as a man's thigh, the bark still clinging to its shaft in strips, the wood dark with fluids that had long since oxidized to a rusty brown. Zachary was not a man easily shaken. He had spent 15 years as an industrial safety inspector, had documented the aftermath of crane collapses and chainsaw kickbacks, and a logging truck that had rolled downhill and crushed 2 men against a granite outcropping. But there was something in the geometry of the image that hollowed out his stomach and filled the cavity with ice. The ribs were not merely broken, they were arranged. The branch had not struck the body. It had been driven through it with precision, pinning it to the tree like a lepidopterist specimen, and the spacing of the shattered bones suggested that the victim had still been alive when it happened, the ribs flexing outward in a scream that had never been completed. Zachary turned the photograph over, hoping for context, for explanation, for anything that might transform this artifact from a message into a mistake. But the back was blank except for a single smudge of sap that had been pressed into the paper, amber and fragrant, still sticky after however many days it had waited for him. He drove the logging road in silence, the photograph tucked into the breast pocket of his flannel shirt, its corners digging into his sternum like small accusations. The Hoquiam Creek timber lease was 47,000 acres of old-growth forest that had survived the clear-cutting frenzy of the 1980s only because the terrain was too steep and the soil too unstable for the massive equipment that had devoured the surrounding valleys. Now it belonged to a modern sustainable logging company called Verdant Reach, which specialized in selective harvesting and carbon offset marketing, and which had called Zachary in to investigate what their internal reports euphemistically referred to as a statistical anomaly in workplace safety metrics. 3 workers had died in 8 weeks. 7 more had been hospitalized. The injuries all fell under the umbrella of falling limb syndrome, a term that Zachary had never encountered in any of his professional journals, and which the company's risk management team had invented to describe a series of accidents that shared one common and inexplicable feature. Every victim had been struck by a heavy branch or limb that seemed to have traveled horizontally rather than vertically, impacting them with lateral force that defied both gravity and meteorology. The forensic reports, which Zachary had reviewed in the flickering light of a motel lamp the night before, were maddening in their clinical confusion. A branch 40 inches in length and 8 inches in diameter had struck a feller named Marcus DeWitt with enough force to pulverize his clavicle and first 3 ribs. Yet the impact pattern indicated that the projectile had been traveling parallel to the ground, striking him in the left temple while he walked through a corridor of Douglas fir that showed no evidence of wind disturbance, no lightning damage, no mechanism by which a half-ton section of Deadwood could have achieved ballistic velocity across a 15-foot gap between trees. The coroner had noted, in a handwritten addendum that seemed almost embarrassed by its own speculation, that the wound resembled something produced by a high-powered air rifle or a compressed air cannon, but no such equipment had been found on the site, and no human agency could explain the trajectory. The base camp sat in a natural clearing 3 miles from the nearest paved road, a collection of modular structures and equipment yards that looked like a lunar outpost dropped into a cathedral of moss and bark. Zachary pulled his truck into the gravel lot and sat for a moment, watching the tree line. The forest here was wrong in a way that he could not immediately articulate. He had grown up in the woods of northern Idaho, had spent his childhood beneath canopies of ponderosa pine and western larch, and he knew the rhythms of healthy woodland, the stochastic music of birdsong, the rustle of squirrels and voles in the understory, the distant percussion of woodpeckers hammering against hollow trunks. But the Hocqueum Creek forest was silent in a manner that felt intentional, as though the entire biome had agreed to hold its breath. He stepped out of the truck and closed the door, the sound of the latch snapping shut echoing across the clearing like a gunshot, and in the wake of that sound there was only the wet dripping of condensation from the branches overhead, a slow and rhythmic precipitation that did not seem to correspond to any actual rain. The air smelled of cedar and rot and something else, something sharper, like copper left out in vinegar. The site manager, a compact man named Gerald Flesher, who wore a hard hat that had been dented so many times it resembled modern sculpture, met Zachary at the door of the main modular office with a handshake that was too firm and too brief. Gerald's eyes kept drifting upward, not to the sky but to the canopy, scanning the mesh of branches overhead with the unconscious vigilance of a soldier watching for snipers. "Zachary Holt, safety inspector," Zachary said, producing his credentials from a leather case that had softened with age. "You called about the accidents." Gerald took the credentials without looking at them, his gaze still fixed on the tree line. "Not accidents," he said, his voice low and gravelly from decades of cigarette smoke. "Something else. But I didn't call you. Corporate called you. I didn't want anyone else out here. I wanted to shut the whole operation down and burn the equipment and let the forest have it back." Zachary followed Gerald into the office, a cramped space that smelled of instant coffee and thermal paper. The walls were plastered with topographical maps and incident reports and photographs of the deceased, arranged in a grid that reminded Zachary uncomfortably of the ribcage pinned to the cedar tree, another collection of human remains organized for display. Gerald poured coffee into a mug that read "World's Okayest Boss" and gestured toward a folding chair. "The first one was Ernie Calhoun," Gerald said, not bothering with preliminaries. "Been falling timber since before you were born, probably. Knows these woods like his own backyard. He's walking a survey line-up on Sector 4, middle of the afternoon, clear sky, no wind to speak of. Suddenly he's on the ground with a branch through his chest, not falling on him, through him like a spear. The branch entered between his third and fourth ribs on the right side and exited through his scapula. The angle was flat, perfectly flat. I measured it myself." Zachary opened his notebook, the pen hovering over the page. "You were there." "I found him," Gerald said, his eyes glazing slightly as he retreated into the memory. "He was still alive when I got to him, conscious even. He looked at me and he said, 'It threw it, Jerry, it threw it like a javelin.' And then he died." The branch was a section of dead cedar, stripped clean, no bark, polished smooth as a fence post. It weighed maybe 40 pounds. There was no way it fell from a tree and achieved that kind of penetration. No way. Zachary wrote this down, his handwriting deteriorating as the narrative progressed. "And the others?" Marcus DeWitt, same story. Horizontal impact. Blunt force trauma to the skull. The branch that hit him was still green, still flexible, but it struck him with enough velocity to shatter his temporal bone. Then we had the cluster, 3 men in one day, all in Sector 7. Louis Morales got his ankle snapped by something that came out of nowhere, struck him from behind while he was running. The branch wrapped around his leg like a bullwhip and snapped the tibia clean through. The other 2 men, Patel and Akafor, they were trying to help him when something bigger came down. Patel took a branch in the abdomen that ruptured his spleen. Akafor caught one in the throat. He drowned in his own blood before anyone could reach him. Gerald fell silent, staring into his coffee as though trying to read auguries in the brown liquid. "The thing is," he said finally, "the men have been hearing things, before the accidents I mean. A sound in the canopy, like something heavy moving through the branches but not falling, moving with purpose. And a smell, like a wet dog but worse. Like a wet dog that's been dead for a week." "Has anyone seen it?" Zachary asked. "Seen what?" "Whatever's doing this." Gerald laughed, a short, barked sound devoid of humor. "A few of the men say they've seen shadows, movement in the high branches, but nothing clear, nothing you could point a camera at. Old Hank, that's Henry Duffresney, he's been logging these woods for 40 years. He says it's the Agropelter. Says it's lumberjack campfire bullshit, but he says it anyway every night like a prayer." The Agropelter. Old lumberjack legend. Supposed to live in the hollow trees, come out to throw deadwood at anyone who trespasses. The woodsman's boogeyman. Hank says it's nonsense, but he won't go into Sector 7 anymore. Won't even look at the maps for that sector. Says the canopy there has gone wrong. Zachary finished his notes and closed the notebook. "I'd like to speak with Hank, and I'd like to walk the sectors where the incidents occurred." "Walk careful," Gerald said, his eyes drifting upward again. "And don't look up. That's what the survivors say. Whatever you do, don't look up." Zachary found old Hank in the equipment yard, sharpening a chainsaw blade with a file that he worked with the meditative precision of a monk at prayer. Hank was 72 years old, his body twisted by decades of lifting and falling and surviving, his face a topographical map of scars and sun damage. He looked up when Zachary approached, his eyes small and bright and suspicious beneath the brim of a canvas hat that had been patched so many times it was more thread than fabric. "You're the safety inspector," Hank said, not making it a question. "I am. I'd like to ask you about the Agropelter." Hank's hand stopped moving. The file hovered above the blade, frozen in mid-stroke. "I told Gerald, and I'll tell you, it's campfire bullshit. Stories we told the greenhorns to keep them from wandering off alone at night. There ain't no such thing as the Agropelter." "But you won't go into Sector 7. The old man's jaw tightened, a muscle fluttering beneath the grizzled skin. "Sector 7 is bad ground, always has been. The trees there are hollow, rotted through. You can hear the wind singing in them like flutes. Bad acoustics, makes a man jumpy." Gerald said the birds have stopped singing there. "The birds have stopped singing everywhere on this lease," Hank said, resuming his filing with a violence that suggested he wished the blade were something else's neck. "Haven't you noticed? The whole forest's gone quiet. Not natural quiet, empty quiet, like something's eating the sound." "What do you think is causing the accidents?" Hank set down the file and looked at Zachary with an expression that mingled pity and contempt. "You want to know what I think? I think it's windthrow. I think it's deadfall. I think it's men not paying attention to their surroundings because they're too busy staring at their phones. I think it's explainable, rational, and ordinary. And I think the reason you can't explain it is because you don't know enough about forests to know what you're looking at. Then you'll come with me to Sector 7. Show me what I'm missing. Hank was silent for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the tree line beyond the equipment yard. "No," he said softly. "I won't. I told you it's bad ground, and I'm too old to die on bad ground." Zachary walked the sectors alone that morning, carrying a GPS unit and a camera, and a sense of mounting unease that he could not shake. Sector 4, where Ernie Calhoun had died, was a gentle slope of second-growth cedar that had been thinned the previous season, the stumps still oozing sap, the slash piles arranged in neat rows awaiting burning. Zachary found the tree where Calhoun had been impaled, the cedar trunk still bearing a dark stain in the shape of a man's torso, the bark splintered around the point of entry. He photographed it from multiple angles, noting the height of the wound, 5 feet 6 inches from the ground, perfectly level, and the absence of any broken branches above that might indicate a falling limb. The surrounding trees showed no sign of recent trauma, no lightning strikes, no wind damage. The branch that had killed Calhoun had come from elsewhere, had traveled horizontally across a gap of at least 12 feet, and had struck with enough force to penetrate flesh and bone and pin a grown man to a tree trunk. Zachary stood before the stain for a long time, listening to the silence, and he became aware gradually of a sound that did not belong in the forest. A rhythmic, wet slap slap slap, like flesh being struck against flesh, coming from somewhere high above him, moving through the canopy with a speed that suggested something large and deliberate. He looked up, his neck craning against the resistance of his collar, and for a moment he thought he saw a shape silhouetted against the filtered light, a distortion in the mesh of branches that might have been a limb or might have been something that had learned to imitate one. Then the sound stopped, and the silence rushed back in like water filling a void, and Zachary realized he had been holding his breath. He found Sector 7 in the early afternoon, after hiking through a draw that had been choked with devil's club and salmonberry. The transition was abrupt and unmistakable. One moment he was walking through healthy forest, the understory rustling with the small commerce of insects and mice, and the next he stepped across an invisible threshold into a landscape that felt drained of vitality. The trees here were ancient cedars and Douglas fir, their trunks so vast that Zachary could not have encircled them with his arms. But they were hollow, he could see that immediately, the bases of the trunks riddled with cavities that opened into darkness. The bark was sloughing off in sheets, revealing wood that had gone the color of bone beneath, and the branches overhead were festooned with hanging moss that moved in a wind Zachary could not feel. The silence was absolute. Not even the drip of condensation penetrated it. Zachary walked deeper into the sector, his boots sinking into a loam that seemed to pull at him with each step, and he became aware of a smell that grew stronger as he progressed. The smell Gerald had described. The wet dog stench multiplied and amplified into something that made his eyes water and his throat contract. It was the smell of decomposition, but not the clean decomposition of leaf litter and fallen wood. It was the smell of something animal, something massive, something that had been living in its own filth for a very long time. He found the first sign of the pantry before he realized what he was looking at. A scrap of fabric, red and black plaid, caught on the thorns of a wild rose bush. Then a boot, leather cracked and green with mold, lying beside a stump. Then the blood, dried to a brown crust on the trunk of a hollow cedar, splattered in a pattern that suggested arterial spray. Zachary photographed everything, his hands trembling slightly on the camera, and as he rounded the massive trunk of a fallen sequoia that had created a natural corridor through the understory, he found the first body. It was not fresh. It had been here for weeks, maybe months, reduced to bones and scraps of clothing and hair that had been bleached by whatever chemical process the forest was subjecting it to. But the arrangement was what made Zachary gag and turn away, his stomach heaving. The skeleton had been pinned to the trunk of a standing cedar by dozens of small branches, each one driven through the bones with the precision of a surgeon's stitch, holding the remains in a standing position, arms outstretched, legs splayed. The skull was tilted back, the jaw open in a rictus that suggested the victim had been screaming when the branches were driven home, and the eye sockets were filled with pine needles, packed tight as though something had been trying to plug the holes. Zachary stumbled backward, his heel catching on a root, and he went down hard on the loam, the impact driving the air from his lungs. As he lay there gasping, he looked up at the canopy, and this time he saw it clearly. It was crouched on a branch 40 feet above him, a shape that seemed to have been assembled from spare parts of other animals, apes and insects and something almost human. The body was thin to the point of emaciation, covered in hair that was the color of wet bark, matted with sap and moss and what might have been blood. The face was elongated, the jaw protruding, the eyes set deep beneath a ridge of bone that cast them in permanent shadow. But the arms, Zachary's mind could not process the arms. They were twice the length of the body, corded with muscle that moved beneath the skin like snakes in a sack, terminating in hands that had too many fingers, each one ending in a black claw that had been worn to a point by use. The creature held a branch, a section of dead cedar stripped of bark and smoothed by what looked like years of handling, and it was studying Zachary with an intelligence that was unmistakable, a cold and assessing gaze that calculated weight and distance and trajectory. Zachary tried to scream, but his throat had locked tight, and in the moment that he lay paralyzed on the forest floor, the creature raised its arm and threw. The branch missed him by inches. It struck the cedar trunk beside his head with a sound like a gunshot, embedding itself 2 inches into the wood, the vibration of the impact singing through the tree and into the ground beneath Zachary's spine. He scrambled backward on his elbows, his mouth open in a silent scream, his eyes never leaving the canopy. The creature was gone, vanished into the mesh of branches with a fluidity that suggested it had never been there at all. But the sound of its movement echoed through the hollow trees, a wet slap 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 that receded into the distance, and beneath it, almost too faint to hear, something that might have been laughter. Zachary ran. He ran without dignity, without direction, crashing through the Devil's Club and the Salmonberry, his lungs burning, his heart hammering against his ribs with a violence that made him fear it would burst. He did not look back. He did not look up. He ran until he broke from the tree line into the equipment yard, where Gerald and Hank and 3 other workers were standing in a cluster, their faces turning toward him with expressions of alarm that seemed to come from very far away. Zachary collapsed to his knees in the gravel, his hands scraping against the stones, and he vomited until there was nothing left but bile and terror. When he could speak, when his breath had returned in ragged gasps, he looked up at Gerald and said the only thing he could think of. There are more bodies in Sector 7, dozens of them, pinned to the trees, and there's something living in the canopy, something that knows how to throw. Hank's face went gray. He looked at the tree line, then at Zachary, then back at the tree line. "I told you," he whispered. "God help us, I told you it was real." That night, Zachary sat in the main modular office while Gerald made phone calls that went unanswered, or were answered with skepticism that bordered on hostility. The sheriff's department in Hoquiam had heard rumors about the Hoquiam Creek lease, had dismissed them as union sabotage or insurance fraud. The state police were uninterested in anything that did not involve a measurable blood alcohol level. The corporate offices of Verdant Reach had gone to voicemail, and the voicemail had not been returned. Zachary listened to Gerald's increasingly desperate pleas with a numbness that had settled over him like a heavy blanket, and he kept one hand on the photograph in his breast pocket, the edges of the print digging into his chest like a reminder of something he had not yet understood. The office was crowded now with workers who had heard fragments of Zachary's story and who were filling the gaps with their own fears, their own rumors, their own half-remembered stories of the Agropelter. A young bucker named Trey Williams kept saying that he had heard the slap 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 for 3 nights running, that it had followed him from Sector 3 to Sector 5, always overhead, always just out of sight. A loader operator named Suze Okonkwo said she had found piles of stripped branches arranged in concentric circles near the landing zone, like someone had been practicing shot put with 40-pound sections of Deadwood. Old Hank sat in the corner, saying nothing, his eyes fixed on the ceiling with a stare that suggested he was watching something the rest of them could not see. "We need to evacuate," Zachary said, interrupting Gerald mid-call. "Tonight. Now. Whatever that thing is, it's not a bear, it's not a cougar, it's not anything that behaves according to the rules of nature. It has an arsenal, it has a pantry of bodies. It has been doing this for a long time, and it knows these woods better than any of us ever will." "Evacuate to where?" Gerald asked, slamming the phone down. "The road is 3 miles away, and the only vehicles are the ones in the yard. We have 2 trucks and a jeep, and there are 19 of us." "Then we take the trucks and we walk the rest," Zachary said. "We stay in the open, away from the trees. We move fast and we don't stop." "And if it follows us?" "It will follow us," Hank said, his voice emerging from the corner like smoke from a fire. "That's what it does. It herds. It throws to wound and then it waits. It lets the prey run until they're tired, until they're bleeding, until they can't run anymore. And then it finishes them. I've seen it before. Not here. Up north in the Olympic Peninsula 30 years ago, a crew of 12 went into a valley and only 3 came out. The survivors said the same thing Zachary said. Something in the trees, something that throws. The company buried the story, paid off the families, blamed it on a windstorm. But I saw the bodies. I saw what the branches had done." The room fell silent. Outside, the forest had begun to make sounds again, but they were not the sounds of a healthy woodland. They were the sounds of something heavy moving through the canopy, branch by branch, approaching the clearing with a patience that was more terrifying than any roar or scream could have been. The slap 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 was audible now, rhythmic and wet, and beneath it was a creaking, a stretching, like rope being tensioned to its breaking point. Zachary looked at the ceiling, at the thin metal and insulation that separated them from the sky, and he imagined the creature up there, moving from tree to tree, circling the camp, calculating angles and distances, selecting its ammunition from the curated piles of deadwood that it had prepared for exactly this moment. He thought of the ribcage in the photograph, the radial pattern of shattered bone, the branch driven through with such precision that it had pinned the remains to the tree like a display, a trophy, a warning. And he understood with a clarity that made his teeth ache that the photograph had not been evidence. It had been an invitation. "The lights," Trey Williams whispered, pointing to the window. "It's cutting the lights." The generator that powered the base camp's electrical system coughed once, twice, and died. The fluorescent tubes in the ceiling flickered and went dark, plunging the office into a darkness that was absolute and suffocating. In the blackness, Zachary could hear the breathing of 19 men and women, each of them holding their breath, each of them listening to the sound of something moving overhead, something that had been waiting for the darkness, something that had learned to use the tools of its environment with an intelligence that no animal should possess. And then the first branch came through the window. It was a section of alder, green and flexible, but it struck the glass with the velocity of a bullet, shattering the pane into 1,000 diamond fragments that sprayed across the room like shrapnel. The branch embedded itself in the far wall, quivering with residual force, and in the moment before the screaming started, Zachary saw something at the window, a face, elongated and ape-like, pressed against the jagged remains of the glass, the eyes reflecting the moonlight with a luminescence that was not quite yellow and not quite green. Then it was gone, and the branches began to fall like rain. Not fall, fly. They came through the windows and the thin walls of the modular structures with a precision that was surgical, each one aimed at a specific target, each one selected for its weight and its aerodynamic properties. A branch the thickness of a baseball bat struck Suze Okonkwo in the shoulder, spinning her around with a force that dislocated the joint and sent her crashing into the filing cabinets. Another, thinner and sharper, passed through the neck of a young surveyor named Park, opening his carotid artery in a spray that painted the ceiling in arterial red. Trey Williams caught a branch in the stomach, doubling him over, and before anyone could reach him, a second branch took him in the back of the skull with a sound like a melon dropped from a great height. Zachary grabbed Gerald by the collar and dragged him toward the door, his ears ringing with the screams and the impacts and the wet slap 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 that seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding them, enclosing them, turning the base camp into a kill box of splintering wood and blood. They burst through the door into the night, and the moonlight revealed a scene from a nightmare. The clearing was no longer empty. It was filled with projectiles, branches and limbs and sections of trunk that had been launched from the canopy with such force that they had buried themselves in the ground like the stakes of a palisade, creating a fence of deadwood that blocked the road to the vehicles. The 2 trucks and the Jeep had been targeted specifically, their windshields shattered, their tires punctured by sharpened stakes driven through the rubber with impossible accuracy. The creature was not just defending its territory, it was conducting a siege, using the principles of battlefield engineering to trap its prey, to corral them, to ensure that there was no escape except in the direction it chose. And the direction it chose was back into the forest, into the dense heart of Sector 7, where the hollow trees waited like open mouths. The riverbed, Hank shouted, appearing from somewhere behind them, his face streaked with blood that was not his own. The old dry riverbed on the eastern boundary. It's clear, no canopy, no cover for the thing, if we can reach it. A branch the size of a man's leg struck the gravel 3 feet from where they stood, the impact throwing shards of stone that cut Zachary's cheek like shrapnel. He did not look up. He grabbed Gerald's arm and ran, following Hank's bent and hobbling form toward the eastern tree line, their boots slipping on the blood-slicked gravel. Behind them, the survivors were emerging from the shattered modules, some wounded, some whole, all of them driven by a panic that had stripped away language and reason and left only the primal imperative of flight. The slap 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 was louder now, closer, and Zachary could feel the weight of the canopy above them like a physical pressure, the branches parting and closing as something vast and terrible moved through them, keeping pace with the fleeing humans, hurting them, directing them, playing with them. A branch struck the ground beside a running loader operator named Vasquez, catching his ankle and flipping him into the air with a violence that snapped the bone audibly. He landed screaming, clutching his leg, and before anyone could stop a second, Branch took him in the chest, pinning him to the earth like a butterfly on a board, the blood bubbling from his lips in a pink froth that turned black in the moonlight. "Don't stop," Zachary screamed, though he did not recognize his own voice. "Don't look back, run." They ran into the forest, into the darkness between the hollow trees, and the creature let them go, let them penetrate deeper into its domain, and the sound of its movement in the canopy above was like the laughter of something that had all the time in the world. The forest swallowed them with a greed that felt almost deliberate, the hollow cedars closing ranks behind the fleeing survivors, until the base camp and its massacre were lost somewhere in the darkness, separated by a maze of trunks and branches that seemed to shift and rearrange when not directly observed. Zachary ran at the front of the group, his hand clamped around Gerald's wrist, dragging the site manager forward with a strength that came from adrenaline and terror rather than any conscious will. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit were not the crashing of something moving through underbrush, but the soft, rhythmic slap 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 of flesh against bark, a sound that traveled through the canopy overhead with a speed that mocked their stumbling progress on the ground. There were 12 of them now, 12 survivors from the original 19, and the gaps in their number told a story of systematic predation that Zachary could not bear to assemble in his mind. Vasquez, pinned to the earth. Park, throat opened. Trey Williams' skull collapsed. Sue's Okonkwo, shoulder shattered, left behind in the office when a branch had blocked the door, and the screams had lasted for 30 seconds before stopping abruptly. 3 others whose names Zachary had not learned, whose faces were already blurring into a composite of terror that he would carry for the rest of his life, however long that might be. Hank ran beside him, the old man's breath coming in ragged wheezes that suggested his lungs were operating on memory alone, his body propelled by a fear that transcended the physical limitations of age and exhaustion. "The riverbed," he gasped, pointing with a trembling finger toward a gap in the trees where the darkness seemed slightly less absolute. "Half a mile east. Old creek bed, dried up in the 70s. No trees, just rock and silt, if we can reach it." A branch struck the trunk of a cedar not 3 feet from Zachary's head, embedding itself with a vibration that showered him in bark and splinters. He flinched but did not stop, did not look up, kept his eyes fixed on the ground before him where the roots and rocks and fallen logs created a topography of tripping hazards that demanded his full attention. The creature was hurting them, he realized with a clarity that cut through the fog of panic. It was not trying to kill them all at once. It was directing them, using the threat of thrown branches to channel their flight along a specific path, away from the open riverbed and deeper into the dense heart of the forest where the canopy was thickest, and the hollow trees waited like gatekeepers to some underworld. Every time the group tried to veer toward the east, toward the promise of open sky and escape, a branch would strike the ground before them or whip past their heads with a velocity that turned air into a weapon, forcing them back onto the path the creature had chosen. "It's pushing us," Zachary said between breaths, the words coming out as a croak. "It's not hunting, it's farming." "What?" Gerald managed, his face a mask of blood and mud and tears that had dried in streaks down his cheeks. "The pantry," Zachary said, remembering the skeleton pinned to the cedar, the arranged bones, the eye sockets stuffed with pine needles. "It doesn't eat them all at once. It keeps them. It pins them to the trees and it keeps them until it's ready. We're being driven to the larder." The realization spread through the group like a contagion, and 2 of the survivors, a young woman named Maya Chen who worked as a geese surveyor and a heavy-set equipment mechanic whose name Zachary thought might be Doug, began to slow, their faces slack with a hopelessness that was more dangerous than any physical wound. "We can't outrun it," Maya said, her voice flat and affectless. "We can't hide from it, it's above us. It's always above us." "Then we don't outrun it," Zachary said, grabbing her arm and pulling her forward with a violence that shocked them both. "We outthink it. It's smart, but it's not smarter than us. It has patterns. It has habits. We just need to find the gap in its strategy." "And how do we do that?" Doug asked, his voice breaking on the last word as a branch whipped past his ear close enough to draw a line of blood. "By doing what it doesn't expect," Zachary said, though he had no idea what that might be, no plan beyond the desperate improvisation of a man who had seen too much in one night to ever sleep again. They ran for what felt like hours but might have been minutes, time dilating and contracting in the darkness, until Zachary's sense of duration was as shattered as his sense of safety. The hollow trees grew denser, their trunks wider, their cavities larger and darker and somehow more intentional, as though they had been hollowed out not by rot and time, but by something that had excavated them for a specific purpose. The smell worsened with each step, the wet dog stench of the creature mingling with something older and more complex, a fermentation of decay that suggested not just death but preservation, not just killing but curation. And then, emerging from the darkness like a cathedral of bone and bark, they found the great cedar. It was the largest tree Zachary had ever seen, a cedar that must have been 1,000 years old, its base spanning 40 feet across, its trunk rising into the canopy like a pillar supporting the sky itself. But it was dead, killed by some internal rot that had consumed it from the heart outward, leaving a hollow that was not a cavity but a chamber, an entrance that gaped like a mouth open in a scream. The interior was visible even in the darkness, illuminated by some phosphorescence that clung to the walls in patches of pale green. And as Zachary's eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw that the walls were not wood but something else, something that reflected the glow with a texture that was wrong, that was organic in a way that made his stomach clench with a premonition of what he was about to discover. They were bodies, dozens of them, pinned to the interior walls of the hollow cedar with branches and stakes and sharpened limbs, arranged in rows that spiraled upward into the darkness of the chamber, each one at a different stage of decomposition, from fresh enough to still wear expressions of final agony to skeletons that had been stripped of every soft tissue by time and insects and something else, something that had licked the bones clean. The bodies were not eaten in the conventional sense. They were displayed, curated, kept in this arboreal charnel house like specimens in a museum or trophies in a hunter's lodge. Some were still clothed, their work shirts and jeans hanging in tatters from frames that had been reduced to sticks and sinew. Others were naked, the skin removed with a precision that suggested the work of a skilled butcher, the flesh carved away in strips that had been hung to dry from the branches overhead like some obscene jerky. The air inside the cedar was thick with the smell of putrefaction and preservation, a paradoxical combination of rot and salt that suggested the creature had learned to treat its kills with something that slowed decomposition, that kept them fresh for longer than nature would allow. "Oh God," Maya whispered, her hand pressed against her mouth, her eyes wide and unblinking as they tracked up the spiral of bodies. "Oh God, oh God, oh God." "This is the pantry," Hank said, his voice hollow and distant, as though he were speaking from the bottom of a well. "This is where it keeps them. This is where it brings them when it's done playing." Zachary forced himself to look, forced himself to catalog the horror with the same clinical detachment he used for accident reports and safety violations. The victims were not random. They were selected, arranged, displayed according to some system that was not immediately apparent, but that suggested a mind capable of categorization and preference. The bodies were pinned not with random branches but with specific implements, each one stripped of bark and smoothed and sharpened to a point, the wood darkened by repeated use until it looked almost like iron. And at the base of the chamber, piled like cordwood against the wall, was the arsenal. It was a cache of ammunition that defied comprehension, a stockpile of deadwood limbs that had been curated with a care that suggested not just intelligence but artistry. Each branch had been selected for its weight and its balance and its aerodynamic properties, stripped of bark and twigs, smoothed by handling and use, until they were as polished as baseball bats or javelins or the bolts of a crossbow. There were hundreds of them, maybe thousands, arranged in neat stacks that filled the lower third of the hollow cedar, a magazine of organic projectiles that had been gathered and prepared over years, maybe decades, each one tested and refined, and added to the collection with a patience that was more terrifying than any display of brute strength could have been. The creature was not just an animal defending its territory. It was a strategist, an engineer, a warrior that had evolved or learned to use its environment with a sophistication that rivaled human technology. "It's been doing this for a long time," Gerald said, his voice barely audible above the wet drip of condensation from the chamber's ceiling. "This isn't new. This isn't because we came here. We just walked into something that's been happening for generations." "The logging company," Zachary said, a piece of the puzzle clicking into place with a suddenness that made his teeth ache. "They didn't tell us everything. They knew. They must have known. This is why they bought this lease, why they kept it isolated, why they never sent more than 20 workers at a time. We're not employees, we're tribute." "What?" Maya turned to him, her face pale and streaked with tears. "Think about it," Zachary said, his mind racing ahead of his fear, propelled by an analytical instinct that had survived even the horror of the night's events. "Verdant Reach is a sustainable logging company. They own dozens of leases, but they keep this one isolated, understaffed, barely profitable. They keep sending people in and the people keep dying and they keep sending more. It's not negligence. It's ritual. They're feeding it. They've made a deal with it, or they've learned to accept its existence, and they're using the workers as. As what? Doug asked, his voice rising to a near shriek. As sacrifices, as human sacrifices to a tree monster. That's insane, that's. A branch struck the entrance to the hollow cedar with a sound like a cannon firing, embedding itself in the wood and sending splinters flying into the chamber. The group flinched as one, pressing themselves against the walls of bodies, against the cold and the smell and the overwhelming presence of death that surrounded them. The slap, slap, slap was directly overhead now, circling the great cedar, and in the gaps between the impacts Zachary could hear something else. A breathing, deep and rhythmic and wet, like a bellows being worked in a forge, the respiration of something massive that was circling its larder, checking its stores, perhaps surprised to find the prey had wandered into the pantry of their own accord. "We can't stay here," Hank whispered. "This is where it brings the dead. If it finds us here, we'll be added to the collection." "We need weapons," Zachary said, his eyes scanning the arsenal of branches at his feet. "It uses these against us. We can use them against it." "Have you seen it throw?" Doug asked, his voice hysterical. "Have you seen the speed, the accuracy? We can't throw a stick as fast as that thing can. We'd be like children throwing pebbles at a tank." "We don't need to throw as fast," Zachary said, bending down and selecting a branch that felt balanced in his hand, its weight familiar and reassuring despite its gruesome provenance. "We just need to throw when it can't see us coming. We need to get out of this forest into the open, and we need to make it follow us somewhere it doesn't want to go." "The riverbed," Hank said again. "I've been saying it since the start. The riverbed. No canopy, no cover, no way for it to move without being seen." "Then we need to reach the riverbed," Zachary said. "And we need to do it without it knowing where we're going. We need to split up to confuse it too." "No," Maya said, her voice firm despite the trembling of her hands. "No, we are not splitting up. Every horror movie, every survival story, every piece of advice ever given about escaping predators says the same thing. Do not split up. We stay together. We move as a unit, and we find another way to confuse it." "Then what do you suggest?" Zachary asked, genuinely curious despite the desperation of their situation. Maya's practical intelligence had been evident even in the brief time he had known her, her work as a surveyor giving her a spatial awareness that the others lacked. "Fire," she said. "The forest is dry. The hollow trees are full of rot and deadwood. We set a fire, create a barrier, force it back while we escape." "We'll burn the whole forest down," Gerald said, "including us." "Not if we control it," Maya replied. "Not if we burn a specific corridor, a controlled burn that gives us a path to the riverbed while cutting off its approach from above. We use the fire the way it uses the branches, as a tool, as a weapon, as a way to shape the battlefield." The idea was madness, Zachary knew. A controlled burn in old-growth forest during the dry season was a recipe for catastrophe, a potential wildfire that could consume thousands of acres and kill them all in the process. But it was also the only idea that offered a shred of hope, the only strategy that turned the creature's greatest advantage, the canopy, the cover, the three-dimensional battlefield, into a liability. Fire climbed. Fire spread through the treetops. Fire would force the Agropelter down to the ground where it was vulnerable, where it could be seen and fought and maybe, just maybe, killed. "We need accelerant," Zachary said. "Fuel, something that burns hot and fast." "The equipment yard," Gerald said. "The trucks had diesel tanks, if any of them survived the attack." "The yard is 3 miles back," Doug interrupted. "Through the thing's hunting ground, we'd never make it." "Then we use what we have," Maya said, reaching into her pocket and producing a Zippo lighter, its chrome surface scratched and dented but functional. "And we use what's already here." She gestured toward the walls of the hollow cedar, toward the desiccated bodies and the dried flesh, and the strips of jerky that hung from the branches overhead. The preservation process, whatever it involved, had left the organic material in a state that was not quite fresh and not quite mummified, a tinder-dry condition that suggested it would burn with an intensity that was almost explosive. And the cedar itself, rotted from within, hollowed out by decades of decay, was a chimney waiting for a spark. "We burned the pantry," Maya said, her voice steady now, her eyes meeting Zachary's with a determination that bordered on ferocity. "We burn its larder, its arsenal, its collection. We take away everything it's built, and we force it to come after us on our terms." "It will be angry," Hank said. "More than angry, it will be enraged. You've seen what it does when it's hunting. Imagine what it will do when it's hunting for revenge." "Then we better run fast," Zachary said, taking the lighter from Maya's hand. "Because when this fire starts, there won't be any more hiding. There won't be any more strategy. There will only be the open riverbed and whatever happens when we reach it." He struck the lighter, the flame springing to life with a sound like a whispered promise, and held it to the nearest strip of dried flesh. It caught immediately, the fire spreading with a speed that was almost supernatural, racing up the strip and across to the next, leaping from body to body with a hunger that seemed to mirror the creature's own appetite. Within seconds, the lower walls of the hollow cedar were ablaze, the flames illuminating the chamber in a flickering orange that transformed the spiral of pinned bodies into a dance macabre of shadow and light. The heat built with terrifying speed, the air becoming unbreathable, the smoke curling upward into the hollow trunk like a living thing seeking escape. "Go," Zachary shouted, grabbing Maya's hand and pulling her toward the entrance. "Go, go, go." They burst from the cedar into the night, and the forest was already reacting to the fire, the flames climbing the outer bark of the great tree and spreading to the branches overhead, catching in the moss and the deadwood and the hanging curtains of lichen that festooned the canopy. The fire did not spread in a circle. It spread in a line, following the natural contours of the forest, consuming the driest sections first and leaving the wetter underbrush temporarily untouched. It was not a controlled burn, Zachary realized with a sinking heart. It was a wildfire that they had unleashed, a force of nature that they had summoned without any hope of controlling it. But it was also a barrier, a wall of flame that rose into the canopy and forced the creature to retreat, its slap, slap, slap receding ahead of the fire line with a speed that suggested fear, real and primal fear, of something that could reach it in its aerial domain. They ran through the burning forest, the heat searing their lungs, the smoke stinging their eyes, the embers falling around them like snow made of fire. Behind them, the great cedar collapsed with a sound like thunder, sending a column of sparks and ash spiraling into the sky, illuminating the canopy in a brief and terrible flash that revealed the creature for the first time in its entirety. It was suspended between two burning Douglas fir, its body outlined in silhouette against the flames, and Zachary saw that his earlier impression had been only a fraction of the truth. The arms were not twice the length of the body. They were 3 times as long, extending from the shoulders in a continuous flow of muscle and sinew that ended in hands with 7 fingers each, the claws extended and gleaming in the firelight. The face was not ape-like but something older, something that predated the separation of human and animal, a visage of pure predatory intelligence that regarded the burning forest with an expression that might have been rage or might have been calculation. And then the branch it was holding came down, not thrown but swung, whipped through the air with a velocity that created a sonic boom, a crack of displaced air that struck the ground beside Zachary and sent him sprawling into the underbrush. "It's still attacking," Gerald screamed, his voice barely audible above the roar of the flames. "The fire isn't stopping it." "It's adapting," Hank shouted back, his old man's voice rising to a pitch that was almost a scream. "It's learning. It knows we set the fire and it's using the smoke for cover." The slap, slap, slap resumed, closer now, moving through the burning canopy with a confidence that suggested the creature was not fleeing, but advancing, using the chaos of the fire to mask its approach, to close the distance, to turn their desperate gambit into another element of its hunting strategy. A branch came whipping out of the smoke, striking Doug in the back of the knee and dropping him instantly, his leg folding beneath him with a sickening crack that was audible even over the fire's roar. Another branch, sharper and thinner, lanced through the darkness and impaled a young logger named Peters through the shoulder, pinning him to a burning trunk with a force that drove the breath from his lungs in a single high-pitched gasp. "Leave them," Zachary shouted, though the words tasted like ash and betrayal. "We can't help them. We have to reach the riverbed." They ran, the group reduced now to 7. Zachary, Maya, Gerald, Hank, and 3 others whose faces Zachary could no longer distinguish in the smoke and the darkness. Their bodies moving on automatic pilot, their minds shut down to everything except the imperative of forward motion. The fire was all around them now, a wall of heat and light that seemed to have no beginning and no end, and in the midst of it the creature moved like a demon born of flame, its branches striking with a precision that defied the chaos of the burning forest. It was hurting them still, Zachary realized through the haze of exhaustion and smoke inhalation, but now it was hurting them toward something specific, something that awaited them in the darkness beyond the fire line, something that the creature had prepared for exactly this contingency. And then, emerging from the smoke like a vision of salvation, they saw it. The riverbed, a wide channel of silt and stone that stretched between the burning forest and the open moonlight beyond, a corridor of bare ground where the canopy had been cleared by some ancient flood and never fully recovered. It was 100 yards wide, maybe more, a killing field exposed to the sky where the creature would have no cover, no concealment, no advantage of elevation from which to launch its projectiles. But it was also 100 yards of open ground, a sprint across naked earth where they would be visible and vulnerable, and exposed to anything that could throw with the accuracy and speed of a machine. "There," Maya screamed, pointing toward the open ground. "The riverbed, we made it." But Zachary was looking up, looking at the tree line that bordered the riverbed on both sides, and what he saw there froze the blood in his veins. The creature was not alone. Arrayed along the branches that overhung the riverbed were dozens of shapes, smaller but identical, wiry bodies crouched in the canopy with the same predatory patience, the same coiled readiness. The Agropelter was not a single monster. It was a colony, a family, a tribe of them that had been living in these woods for generations, breeding and teaching and passing down the knowledge of the kill from one generation to the next. The fire had not driven them back. It had driven them together, had summoned them to the kill site, had turned a single predator into an army. "Oh God," Gerald whispered, his knees buckling, his body collapsing into the mud at the edge of the riverbed. "Oh God, there are so many of them." "We still have to cross," Zachary said, his voice sounding distant and strange in his own ears, as though it belonged to someone else, someone braver or more foolish than he could ever be. "We still have to run. It's our only chance." "There are dozens of them," Maya said, her voice breaking. "We can't outrun dozens." "Then we don't outrun them," Zachary said, bending down and lifting Gerald by the collar, dragging the site manager to his feet with a strength that was born of pure desperation. "We outlast them. We get across that riverbed and we keep moving until we find the road, and we don't stop, and we don't look back, and we pray that whatever these things are, they have limits. They have territories. They have things they fear more than they hate us." "And what if they don't?" Hank asked, his face illuminated by the fire that was consuming the forest behind them, his eyes reflecting the flames with a brightness that suggested tears or madness or both. "Then we die running," Zachary said, "which is still better than dying pinned to a tree." They gathered at the edge of the riverbed, the 7 survivors, their bodies battered and burned and bleeding, their minds pushed beyond the limits of fear into a state of crystalline clarity that accepted death as a probability, but refused it as a certainty. Behind them, the forest burned, the hollow cedars collapsing into showers of sparks that rose like fireflies into the night sky. Above them, along the tree line, the creatures waited, their bodies motionless, their arms coiled like springs, their eyes reflecting the moonlight with a luminescence that was not quite yellow and not quite green. And before them, the riverbed stretched like a gauntlet, 100 yards of open ground that might as well have been 100 miles. On 3, Zachary said, though he did not know why he was counting, what ritual comfort the numbers might provide. 1, 2. Before he could say 3, the first branch came down, not from the tree line but from directly above, launched from a creature that had swung out over the riverbed on its impossibly long arms, using the momentum of its swing to generate velocity that no human arm could match. The branch struck the ground between Zachary and the riverbed with a force that split the stone and sent shards of rock flying like shrapnel. And in the flash of impact, Zachary saw the creature hanging there, suspended in midair, its body twisted like a question mark, its arm already reaching for another missile from the pouch of branches that hung at its waist. It was not just throwing, he realized with a horror that transcended language. It was swinging and throwing, using the elastic potential of its own body like a catapult, amplifying its strength with centrifugal force until the branches became projectiles that traveled faster than sound, faster than thought, faster than any human could possibly dodge. "Run!" Zachary screamed, though the word was lost in the sonic boom of the next branch, and the chase began. The riverbed was a corridor of death disguised as salvation, a strip of open ground that promised escape but delivered exposure. And as Zachary sprinted across the cracked silt and fist-sized stones that comprised its surface, he understood with a clarity that bordered on the religious that the creature had been waiting for this moment, had herded them toward this exact kill zone with the patience of a master strategist who had played this game many times before. The sonic booms followed them like thunderclaps, each one preceding the impact of a branch that struck the riverbed with geological force, splitting the ancient sediment and throwing up plumes of dust and stone that stung Zachary's eyes and filled his mouth with the taste of earth and copper. He did not look up. He had learned that lesson in the forest, had learned it in the blood of those who had looked up and died for their curiosity, and he kept his gaze fixed on the far tree line where the riverbed ended and the logging road began, a distance that seemed to stretch and contract with each step like the elastic fabric of a nightmare. Maya ran beside him, her breath coming in ragged gasps that suggested her lungs were filling with smoke and dust, and the particulate matter of burned forest, her hand clamped around Zachary's wrist with a grip that was desperate and crushing, and somehow reassuring, a human anchor in the chaos of the hunt. Gerald ran behind them, his body bent almost double with exhaustion and fear, his legs moving in a shuffling gait that was more falling forward than running. Hank brought up the rear, the old man's face a mask of blood from a cut above his eye that he must have sustained during the escape from the burning cedar. His arms pumping with a mechanical rhythm that suggested his body had moved beyond conscious control and was operating on the autopilot of survival instinct. Of the other 3 survivors, a young bucker named Tors, a surveyor named Yi, and the equipment mechanic Doug, only Tors remained visible, running in a zigzag pattern that he must have learned from some military manual or action movie, his body weaving back and forth across the riverbed in a desperate attempt to present a moving target to the creatures above. The Agropelters, Zachary's mind had already begun to pluralize the entity, to acknowledge the multiplicity of the threat that had been revealed in the firelight, were not simply throwing branches from the tree line. They were swinging out over the riverbed on their prehensile arms, using the momentum of their arc to generate velocities that turned Deadwood into missiles capable of penetrating steel, and then releasing at the apex of their swing, to send the projectiles screaming down at angles that no stationary thrower could achieve. It was artillery, pure and simple biological artillery that used the principles of ballistics and trajectory with a sophistication that would have impressed a military engineer. And they were learning, adapting, refining their aim with each throw, bracketing the fleeing survivors with impacts that grew closer and closer with each successive barrage. A branch struck the riverbed 3 feet to Zachary's left, embedding itself to a depth of 6 inches in the compacted silt, the vibration of the impact traveling up through Zachary's boots and into his spine with a jolt that nearly sent him sprawling. He stumbled, caught himself on Maya's arm, and kept running, his legs burning, his heart hammering against his ribs with a violence that made him fear it would burst through his chest like something in an alien movie. Another branch whistled past his ear, close enough to part his hair and leave a line of cold where the displaced air had brushed his skin, and he heard the sonic boom a half-second after the branch had passed, the sound lagging behind the object in a temporal disconnect that made his stomach lurch with nausea. The creatures were throwing faster than sound. They were creating shock waves with their projectiles, turning the air itself into a weapon that could rupture eardrums and pulverize soft tissue even when the branches missed. "Keep moving," Hank screamed from behind them, his voice hoarse and barely audible above the percussion of impacts and the roar of the fire that was consuming the forest to their left, a wall of flame that had begun to spread laterally, threatening to engulf the riverbed and cut off their escape. "Don't stop, don't look up, just run." But Tors had stopped. The young bucker had frozen in mid-stride, his body suddenly rigid, his face turned upward toward the canopy with an expression of fascination that was more terrible than any scream could have been. Zachary saw him there, silhouetted against the moonlit riverbed, his mouth slightly open, his eyes reflecting the firelight with a brightness that suggested he had seen something beautiful in the moment before his death. The branch that took him came not from above but from the side, launched by a creature that had swung out parallel to the riverbed rather than perpendicular, calculating the lead time and the vector with a precision that was almost mathematical. The branch, a section of dead cedar stripped of bark and sharpened to a wicked point, struck Tors in the side of the chest with a force that lifted him off his feet and drove him backward through the air in a trajectory that seemed to defy gravity, his body traveling 15 feet before hitting the ground and sliding another 10, leaving a smear of blood and tissue on the pale silt that looked almost black in the moonlight. "Tors," Gerald screamed, his voice breaking into a sob. "He's gone," Zachary shouted back, pulling Gerald forward with a violence that was born of panic and necessity. "Keep running, he's already dead." They were 2/3 of the way across the riverbed now, maybe 70 yards from the far tree line where the logging road began, and the Agropelters seemed to sense that their prey was escaping. The frequency of the barrage increased, the sonic booms merging into a continuous rolling thunder that filled the air and made it impossible to distinguish individual impacts from the general chaos of destruction. The riverbed surface was cratered like a moonscape, pocked with holes where branches had struck and embedded themselves, creating an obstacle course of splintered wood and shattered stone that forced the survivors to dodge and weave as they ran, slowing their progress and making them easier targets. Yi went down somewhere behind them, his leg snapped by a branch that caught him mid-stride, the bone breaking with an audible crack that was somehow louder than the sonic booms, and before anyone could turn back, a second branch pinned him to the riverbed through the abdomen, his scream rising to a pitch that was almost ultrasonic before cutting off abruptly as his diaphragm was punctured. "The road," Maya screamed, pointing ahead with a trembling finger. "I can see the road." And she was right. Through the haze of dust and smoke and the tears that streamed from Zachary's burning eyes, he could see the pale strip of gravel that marked the logging road, the twin ruts of tire tracks that led away from the forest and toward the distant lights of Hoquiam, toward civilization, toward safety, toward a world where monsters did not swing through the canopy and throw trees like javelins. The road was there, real and solid and attainable, and the sight of it gave Zachary a burst of speed that he did not know his body possessed, his legs pumping harder, his stride lengthening, the distance between him and salvation shrinking with each desperate step. But the Agropelters were not finished. As the survivors reached the far edge of the riverbed, as their boots left the silt and found the firmer ground of the logging road's shoulder, the creatures began to descend from the canopy with a speed that was almost too fast to follow, their long arms uncoiling like springs released, their bodies dropping through the branches in a series of controlled falls that brought them to the ground in postures that were simultaneously simian and insectal, crouched and ready. Zachary saw one of them land not 20 feet from where he stood, its body unfolding from the impact with a fluidity that suggested its bones were not rigid but somehow flexible, its face turning toward him with an intelligence that was unmistakable and ancient and utterly alien. It was larger than he had expected, taller than a man when fully upright, its arms extending to a span of 12 feet or more, each hand ending in 7 black claws that had been worn to surgical sharpness by years of use. The face was the worst part, not because it was grotesque, though it was, but because it was familiar, because it bore a structural resemblance to something almost human, the eyes set forward in the skull for binocular vision, the jaw capable of complex expression, the brow ridged and prominent. It was as though evolution had taken a parallel path in this creature, had developed intelligence and tool use and strategy along a separate branch of the primate family tree, had produced a cousin to humanity that had never descended from the trees but had instead mastered them, conquered them, turned the canopy into a fortress and a factory and a throne. The creature did not attack. It stood at the edge of the riverbed, its body motionless, its eyes tracking Zachary's group with a patience that was more terrifying than any charge could have been. And then, slowly, with a deliberation that suggested communication rather than instinct, it raised one of its 7-fingered hands and pointed toward the road, not at the survivors, at the road itself, at the direction of their escape. It was letting them go. It was choosing not to pursue them onto the open ground where its advantage was neutralized, where its arsenal of branches was useless, where it would be exposed and vulnerable to any weapon that the humans might possess. But there was something else in the gesture, something that Zachary could not immediately identify, a quality of amusement or satisfaction or completion that suggested the creature had achieved what it wanted, had demonstrated what it needed to demonstrate, had proven to these fragile ground-dwelling intruders that the forest belonged to it, and that their survival was not a victory but a gift. "It's not following," Gerald whispered, his voice hoarse and barely audible. "Why isn't it following?" "Because it doesn't need to," Hank said, his old man's face suddenly ancient beyond his years, the firelight casting shadows in the wrinkles that made him look like a statue carved from weathered wood. "Because it's already won, because we were never prey to it. We were messengers." "Messengers?" Maya asked, her hand still clutching Zachary's wrist, her body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline and exhaustion. "Look at it," Hank said, gesturing toward the creature with a trembling hand. "It's not hungry, it's not hunting, it's watching. It's letting us go so we can tell the others, so we can spread the word. So the next group of loggers, the next company, the next batch of trespassers, they'll know what's waiting for them. They'll know the cost of coming here. It's territorial marking, but not with scent or sound, with story, with legend, with fear." The creature lowered its hand and turned away, its body moving with a grace that was almost beautiful, disappearing into the burning forest with a fluidity that suggested it was not fleeing but simply bored, finished with the game, ready to return to the canopy, and the pantry and the arsenal that had been temporarily disrupted by the fire. The other shapes in the tree line withdrew as well, receding into the smoke and the darkness, until only the crackle of the flames and the wet slap-slap-slap of distant movement remained to suggest they had ever been there at all. Zachary stood at the edge of the road, his body shaking with a mixture of relief and horror, and a strange, hollow grief that he could not yet name, and he looked back at the riverbed where the bodies of Tors and Yi lay in postures of violent repose, where the craters and the splintered branches and the smears of blood told the story of a battle that had never been fair, never been winnable, never been anything but a demonstration of power by an enemy that had held all the advantages from the start. The fire was spreading now, consuming the eastern edge of the Hoquiam Creek lease, and in its light the forest looked like something from a medieval painting of hell, a landscape of burning trees and shadowy figures, and the distant sound of something laughing in a language that predated human speech. They walked the logging road in silence, the four survivors, their bodies battered and burned and pushed beyond the limits of endurance, their minds retreating into a numbness that was the only protection against the memories of what they had seen and survived. The road stretched before them like a ribbon of pale dust, winding through clear cuts and second-growth stands that had not yet achieved the density and darkness of the old-growth heart where the Agropelters dwelt. The sky was lightening in the east, a gray dawn that brought no warmth and no comfort, only the revelation of their own wounds in the growing visibility, the cuts and bruises and burns that covered their exposed skin, the blood that had dried encrusted patterns on their clothing, the thousand-yard stares that had replaced whatever expressions they had worn before the night began. They walked for 3 hours before they heard the sound of engines, the distant rumble of diesel trucks approaching from the direction of Hoquiam, and when the convoy appeared around the bend, 2 sheriff's department SUVs, an ambulance, and a logging company truck that must have been summoned by some alarm that Gerald had triggered before the siege began, Zachary felt his legs give way beneath him. His body collapsing into the gravel with a violence that suggested his bones had turned to liquid, his mind finally releasing the iron grip of survival instinct and allowing him to feel the full weight of his exhaustion and terror and grief. He woke in the ambulance, an oxygen mask clamped over his nose and mouth, an IV line running from his arm to a bag of saline that swayed with the motion of the vehicle. Maya sat across from him, her face cleaned of blood and soot but pale as paper, her eyes fixed on some middle distance that only she could see. Gerald was in the front seat, talking in a low and urgent voice to a paramedic who was taking notes with a pen that shook slightly in his hand. Hank was not in the ambulance. Hank had refused treatment, had insisted on riding in the sheriff's vehicle, had wanted to tell his story to someone in authority before the corporate lawyers, and the risk management consultants could arrive and begin the process of sanitizing and spin-doctoring that would inevitably follow. "Where are we?" Zachary asked, his voice muffled by the oxygen mask, his throat raw from smoke inhalation and screaming. 20 minutes from Hoquiam, Maya said, her voice soft and distant, as though she were speaking from underwater. "They found us on the road. The fire department is trying to contain the blaze, but it's spreading fast. They're talking about evacuating the eastern suburbs." "The others?" "Dead, all of them. They're sending a recovery team, but the sheriff says they won't go into the burn zone until it's safe." Zachary closed his eyes, the image of the pantry rising behind his eyelids like a projection on a screen, the spiral of pinned bodies and the arsenal of branches, and the thing in the canopy with its 7-fingered hands and its ancient, patient eyes. "There won't be any bodies to recover," he said. "Not ones they can identify, not ones they can explain." "What do you mean?" "I mean it will clean up after itself. It always has. The companies, the logging outfits, they've been covering this up for decades, maybe centuries. The Agropelter doesn't just kill. It maintains, it curates. It ensures that the forest remains its domain, that the stories remain just stories, that the evidence disappears into the rot and the moss and the hollow trees. We survived because it wanted us to survive, because we were more useful alive than dead. Messengers, like Hank said." Maya was silent for a long moment, her gaze drifting to the window of the ambulance, where the trees of the Pacific Northwest scrolled past in a blur of green and gray, and the occasional flash of fire retardant dropped from aircraft that buzzed overhead like mechanical hornets. "I looked back," she said finally, her voice so quiet that Zachary had to strain to hear it through the oxygen mask. "When we were being loaded into the ambulance, I looked back at the tree line. "Don't," Zachary said, though he knew it was too late. "It was there," Maya continued, as though she had not heard him. "On a high branch where the burn hadn't reached yet, just sitting there perfectly still, not attacking, not throwing, just watching. Its head turned to follow the ambulance as we drove away. And I swear, Zachary, I swear it was smiling." Zachary opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling of the ambulance, at the fluorescent lights and the medical equipment, and the antiseptic surfaces that represented the triumph of human order over the chaos of the natural world. But he knew, with a certainty that would never leave him, that the order was an illusion, that the canopy was still there, that the creatures were still waiting, that the forest was not empty and never had been. It was full of eyes and teeth and the accumulated weight of centuries of predation, full of the bones of those who had thought themselves masters of the wilderness, full of the agropelters and their arsenals and their patient, ancient hunger. The ambulance turned onto the main highway, and Zachary reached into his breast pocket, his fingers finding the edge of the photograph that he had carried since the morning, the image of the shattered ribcage pinned to the cedar tree. He pulled it out and looked at it with new eyes, understanding at last what he was seeing. It was not a photograph of a victim. It was a photograph of a message, a trophy, a warning that had been left for him specifically, placed on his windshield by whatever mechanism the creatures possessed. Perhaps they had learned to use human tools, or perhaps they had simply observed that humans used photographs and had adapted their communication accordingly. The ribcage arranged in that radial pattern was not the result of random violence. It was art. It was language. It was the agropelter's way of saying, "This is what awaits you. This is what happens to those who enter my forest. This is the weight of the canopy, and it will crush you." He turned the photograph over, his fingers finding the smudge of sap that still clung to the back, amber and fragrant and somehow alive, and he understood that the sap was not accidental. It was signature. It was proof of authorship. It was the creature's way of signing its work, of claiming credit for the masterpiece of shattered bone and driven wood that it had created. The photograph had been an invitation, yes, but it had also been a contract, a covenant that Zachary had signed by driving to the Hockweyam Creek lease, by entering the forest, by surviving to tell the tale. He was bound now, bound to the canopy and the weight that pressed down from above, bound to the memory of the slap, slap, slap that would follow him into his dreams for the rest of his life. The ambulance sped toward Hockweyam, toward the hospitals and the press conferences and the investigations that would follow, and Zachary folded the photograph carefully, precisely, along the crease that had formed in his pocket, and he placed it back against his chest, over his heart, where it would beat in time with his pulse like a second heart, a wooden heart, a heart that belonged to the forest and would never let him go. Outside the window, the trees blurred past in an endless procession of green and gray, and in every one of them, in every canopy and every hollow trunk and every shadowed branch, Zachary saw the eyes of the agropelter watching him, waiting for him, knowing that someday, somehow, he would return to the forest where the weight of the canopy was the only law that mattered, and where the bones of the unwary hung like ornaments in the dark. The investigation that followed the Hockweyam Creek massacre, though it was never officially called that, the corporate lawyers preferring the term, industrial accident compounded by unforeseen wildfire conditions, lasted 11 months and produced 3,000 pages of reports that Zachary read in the fluorescent-lit solitude of a motel room in Aberdeen, Washington, paid for by the settlement that Verdant Reach had offered him in exchange for his signature on a non-disclosure agreement that ran to 47 pages of single-spaced legalese. He signed it with a hand that still trembled when he tried to hold a pen for more than a few minutes. The tremor, a souvenir of the branch that had passed close enough to his ear to alter the fluid dynamics of his inner ear, leaving him with a permanent imbalance that made stairs and curbs into daily challenges. The money was sufficient to keep him in cheap motels and cheaper whiskey for the rest of his life, which he calculated at approximately 3 years given the state of his liver and his will to live. But it was not sufficient to buy silence, because Zachary had discovered that the silence was not something that could be purchased. It was something that grew inside him like a tumor, expanding with each passing day until it crowded out every other thought, every other memory, every other impulse except the need to speak, to tell, to warn. He told the story to bartenders and to other motel guests, and to a journalist from the Aberdeen Daily World who listened with professional skepticism, until Zachary showed him the photograph, the ribcage pinned to the cedar, and the journalist's face had gone pale in a way that suggested he had seen something like it before, or had heard rumors, or had grown up in a logging town where the old stories were never quite forgotten. The journalist wrote a piece that ran on page 7 under the headline, "Survivor Claims Tree Monster, Responsible for Hoquiam Creek Deaths," and the piece generated 47 letters to the editor, most of them mocking, 3 of them from other loggers who said they had heard the slap 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 in other forests, in other decades, in other leases where the old growth had been left standing for reasons that no corporate report could adequately explain. The letters were never published. The editor, after a phone call from Verdant Reach's legal department, decided that the story had received sufficient attention and that further coverage would be irresponsible and potentially libelous. But Zachary kept the letters, kept them in a shoebox beneath the motel bed. And on nights when the whiskey was not enough to silence the sounds in his memory, he would read them by the light of a single bulb, searching for patterns, for confirmations, for the outlines of a conspiracy that stretched back farther than any single company or any single forest. The official report concluded that the deaths were caused by a combination of high winds, deadfall, and panic-induced injuries sustained during an unauthorized evacuation. The fire was blamed on a faulty generator. The bodies that could not be recovered, which was most of them, the recovery teams having found only fragments, scraps of clothing, and the occasional bone that had been scattered by animals or by something else, were listed as presumed deceased, remains unlocated. The survivors were offered counseling, which Zachary attended for 3 sessions before the therapist, a pleasant woman in her 40s who specialized in workplace trauma, asked him to stop coming because his stories were disrupting the therapeutic environment for other clients. Maya Chen attended the same counseling sessions and emerged from them with a silence that was deeper than Zachary's own. A withdrawal from human contact so complete that she moved to a cabin in the Olympic Peninsula and was not seen or heard from for 3 years, until a hiker found her journal in a hollow cedar, its pages filled with sketches of branching arms and 7-fingered hands and mathematical formulas that calculated the trajectory of thrown objects with a precision that suggested she had never stopped trying to understand the physics of her own survival. Gerald Flesher returned to his job at Verdant Reach, was promoted to Regional Safety Director, and died 6 months later of a heart attack that struck him while he was walking the perimeter of a new lease in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. The coroner noted that his death was consistent with extreme cardiac stress, but the photograph in the local paper showed something that the coroner had not commented on. Gerald's face, frozen in an expression of terror so profound that it had distorted his features into a mask that resembled the rictus of the victims in the hollow cedar, his eyes wide and staring at something above him that the camera could not capture. Hank Dufresne disappeared 2 weeks after the incident, leaving his apartment in Hoquiam untouched, his breakfast dishes still in the sink, his television still playing a logging documentary that no one had thought to turn off. His body was never found, but a section of cedar branch was discovered outside his back door, stripped of bark and polished smooth, arranged in a pattern that spelled nothing in any human alphabet but that conveyed a message nonetheless. Zachary kept the photograph with him always, carried it in the breast pocket of whatever shirt he was wearing, transferred it from garment to garment with a ritual care that had become obsessive. He studied it with the intensity of a scholar examining a sacred text, noting details that he had missed in the initial shock of discovery. The way the sap had been applied not as a random smudge, but in a deliberate pattern, a spiral that matched the arrangement of the ribs. The way the bark of the cedar trunk behind the ribcage showed indentations that suggested the branch had been driven into the wood not once but multiple times, adjusted and repositioned, until the display achieved the exact effect that the artist desired. The way the photograph itself had been taken from a specific angle, a low angle looking upward, as though the photographer had been kneeling or lying on the ground when the shutter captured the image. It was a GoPro photo, high resolution and wide angle, and Zachary understood now that the camera had not belonged to a human photographer. It had belonged to the creature, or to one of its kind, strapped to a branch or held in one of those seven-fingered hands, and the photograph was not documentation but composition, not evidence but advertisement. He tried to find the camera. He returned to Hoquiam Creek 6 times in the first year, hiking the logging roads that were now closed to public access, slipping past the fences and the warning signs that Verdant Reach had installed to prevent further incidents. The forest had recovered from the fire with a speed that seemed unnatural, the underbrush returning thicker and greener than before, the hollow cedars that had burned now sprouting new growth from their charred trunks in a process of regeneration that suggested the fire had been not destructive but cleansing, a controlled burn that had cleared the old pantry and prepared the forest for a new cycle of accumulation. He found the great cedar on the third visit, or what remained of it, a hollow stump that still smelled of smoke and charred bone, the interior walls blackened but intact, the spiral arrangement of hooks and branches that had held the bodies now empty, waiting for new occupants. The arsenal was gone, the piles of stripped branches removed to some other location, some new cache that Zachary could not locate despite weeks of searching. But the pantry remained, the architecture of death preserved in the carbonized wood, and Zachary understood that the Agropelters had not abandoned this place. They had simply moved their operations deeper into the forest, into sectors that had not been mapped, into hollow trees that had not been discovered, into the dark heart of the old growth, where the canopy was so thick that daylight never reached the forest floor. On his 6th visit, he found the camera. It was a GoPro Hero 7, battered and weathered, its lens cracked but functional, strapped to a branch at the edge of Sector 7 with a binding of vine and sap that was already beginning to fuse with the bark. Zachary reached for it with a hand that shook so violently he had to steady it with the other, and as his fingers closed around the plastic casing, he felt a vibration that was not mechanical but biological, a pulse that traveled up his arm and into his chest with a rhythm that matched the slap-slap-slap of the creature's movement through the canopy. He pulled the camera free and ran, not looking up, not looking back, his boots pounding the logging road with a desperation that he had hoped never to feel again. He reached his truck and drove until the gas gauge read empty, until he was in a town whose name he did not know, until the sun had risen and set and risen again, and he could no longer remember what day it was. The camera's memory card held 3,000 photographs and 17 hours of video. Zachary reviewed them in the order they had been captured, his hands shaking on the motel room desk, the whiskey bottle at his elbow growing emptier with each passing hour. The earliest images were landscapes, forest scenes captured from the canopy perspective, the wide-angle lens distorting the trees into pillars that curved toward a vanishing point in the green-filtered sky. Then came the animals, deer pinned to trunks by branches through the chest, elk arranged in spirals of bone and antler, a bear suspended from a branch by its own intestines, arranged in a pattern that suggested the creature had been experimenting with larger prey, testing the limits of its art. And then the humans, the first loggers, captured in moments of unguarded labor, unaware of the camera above them. Then the first kills, the bodies arranged with increasing sophistication, the compositions growing more complex, the lighting more deliberate as the creature learned to use the filtered sun, and the moon and the phosphorescence of the hollow trees to achieve effects that no human photographer would have conceived. The GoPro was not a tool that the creature had stolen or found. It was a tool that it had adopted, mastered, integrated into its hunting strategy, with the same patience and intelligence that it applied to every other aspect of its existence. The final video on the card was 17 seconds long. It showed the creature itself, suspended from a branch by one of its elongated arms, the other arm extended toward the camera in a gesture that might have been greeting or might have been threat. The face filled the frame, the ape-like features rendered in high-definition detail that revealed textures Zachary had not seen in the firelight. The individual hairs that composed its pelt, each one coated with sap and moss and what looked like dried blood. The pores of its skin, large and dark and somehow reptilian. The eyes, which did not reflect the camera's light but absorbed it, swallowing the illumination into depths that seemed to contain not a single consciousness but a multiplicity, a collective intelligence that had been accumulating for millennia. The creature held the expression for 12 seconds, motionless, studying the lens with a patience that suggested it knew it was being recorded, knew that the recording would be found, knew that the finder would be sitting in a motel room somewhere, drinking whiskey and shaking and wondering if the world had always been this way or if something had changed while humanity was not paying attention. And then, in the final 5 seconds, the creature smiled. It was not a human smile. The lips retracted not upward but sideways, revealing teeth that were not fangs but something more terrible, flat, grinding molars that suggested an omnivorous diet, a digestive system capable of processing not just flesh but bone, wood, sinew, and stone. The smile was the last thing on the video, and when it ended, Zachary sat in the darkness of the motel room, the camera's screen glowing faintly in his lap, and he understood that he had been wrong about the photograph, wrong about the message, wrong about everything. The creature was not warning humanity away from the forest. It was inviting them in. It was advertising. It was building a brand. The weight of the canopy pressed down on him in that darkness, a physical sensation that he could feel in his shoulders and his spine, the accumulated mass of all the branches and all the leaves and all the creatures that moved through them with a grace and a power that humanity had never matched and never would. He thought of the hollow cedar, the pantry, the arsenal, the spiral of pinned bodies rising into the darkness like a staircase to some heaven that no human theology had described. He thought of Maya Chen in her cabin in the Olympics, sketching formulas that calculated the angle of descent, the velocity at impact, the splintering force of wood against bone. He thought of Gerald Flesher's frozen face, of Hank Dufresne's empty apartment, of the 17 others who had died in the forest, and the dozens more who had died in the decades before, and the hundreds more who would die in the decades to come. Because the forest was still there, the canopy was still there, the weight was still there, and it would never be lifted, never be escaped, never be anything but the fundamental condition of existence for anyone foolish enough to walk beneath the trees and think themselves safe. Zachary Holt died 3 years and 4 months after the Hocqueum Creek incident, not in the forest but in a hospital bed in Olympia, Washington, where the nurses noted that his final words were spoken not to any human in the room, but to the ceiling, to the space above him, to the canopy that existed even in the institutional sterility of the ICU, represented by the acoustic tiles and the sprinkler system, and the pipes that carried water and waste through an architecture that was merely the forest translated into human terms. "I see you," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the beeping of the monitors, his eyes fixed on a point in the upper corner of the room where a water stain had formed a pattern that resembled, to anyone who looked closely enough, a human ribcage shattered in a radial pattern and pinned to a surface by a single jagged line. "I see you, and I know what you want, and I'm not afraid anymore." The nurse who recorded his vitals at the time of death noted that his heart rate, which had been erratic and elevated for days, slowed to a normal rhythm in his final moments, then stopped with a gentleness that was unusual in cardiac arrest. As though something had reached into his chest and lifted the weight from his heart, had taken the burden from him, had finally, after all the months of waiting, accepted him into the canopy where the bones hung like fruit, and the arms swung through the darkness with a grace that was almost love. The body was cremated, the ashes scattered in a memorial garden in Aberdeen, and the shoebox of letters and the GoPro camera and the photograph of the ribcage were buried with them, planted beneath a young cedar that Verdant Reach had donated as part of their corporate greening initiative. The cedar grew for 2 years before it began to show signs of hollowing, the bark sloughing off in strips, the trunk developing a cavity that faced east, toward the rising sun, toward the forest where the Agropelters waited. And on the 2nd anniversary of Zachary's death, a hiker in the memorial garden reported finding a branch on the ground beside the tree, stripped of bark and polished smooth, with a GoPro camera strapped to one end and a photograph tucked into the binding, a high-resolution image of a human ribcage perfectly shattered in a radial pattern, pinned to the trunk of a young cedar by a single jagged pine branch. The photograph was turned over to the Aberdeen police, who filed it with the other evidence from the Hoquiam Creek case, which had never been officially closed. It sat in a box in a basement archive for 11 years before a records clerk, digitizing old files, scanned it, and uploaded it to a database that was accessible to anyone with the right credentials. The clerk did not notice the smudge of sap on the back, did not examine the spiral pattern that the sap formed, did not understand that the photograph was not evidence of a crime that had been committed, but an invitation to a crime that was still ongoing, a perpetual performance that required new audiences, new victims, new messengers who would carry the word back to the world of concrete and steel and artificial light. The clerk closed the file and moved on to the next case, and the photograph waited in the digital darkness, searchable and findable and waiting for the right eyes to discover it, the right mind to understand it, the right hand to reach for the phone and dial the number of a logging company that was looking for safety inspectors to investigate a statistical anomaly in workplace safety metrics on a remote stretch of old-growth forest in the Pacific Northwest, where the birds had stopped singing, and the canopy pressed down with a weight that could be felt in the bones of anyone who paused long enough to feel it. The forest remained, the canopy remained, the weight remained, and somewhere in the hollow cedars, in the spiral pantries and the curated arsenals and the ancient patience of something that had never learned to fear humanity, the slap, slap, slap continued, rhythmic and wet and eternal, the heartbeat of a world that had never been empty, had never been safe, had never been anything but hungry. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe, so you don't miss the stories yet to come.